Hello everyone, I'm the Creep's Cabin. I know you use these videos to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I had been driving for hours, and the sun was already gone by the time I reached the stretch of road that cut through the low, wooded hills. It wasn't a highway, just a two-lane road with no lights, the kind of road that's quiet enough at night to make you feel like you're the only person left moving in the world. The dark seemed thicker out here. My headlights carved out a tunnel of pale yellow on the asphalt, and beyond that tunnel was nothing but shadow. The road twisted more than I expected. I slowed down on the curves, my tires crunching lightly over gravel that had spilled from the shoulder. I knew I was in the middle of nowhere because my phone had lost signal over an hour ago, and there hadn't been a single house or gas station in miles. Just black woods and the thin ribbon of road under my tires. The air inside the car was warm, almost stuffy, but every time I thought about opening a window, the idea of the cold night air rushing in made me hesitate. I kept both hands on the wheel, feeling how the tires gripped with each bend. The darkness outside the glass had a weight to it, the kind that made it impossible to see where the trees ended or how deep the forest went. I hadn't seen another vehicle since the last town. No headlights in the rearview mirror, no glow on the horizon ahead of me. It was so quiet that the sound of my engine was the only thing keeping me from noticing just how still the night was. The kind of stillness that makes you wonder if the world has gone silent except for you. I came around another curve, slower this time, because I had a bad habit of overthinking sharp bends in the dark. My high beams washed over a shape on the right side of the road, and my stomach tightened instantly. It was a vehicle, pulled off onto the dirt shoulder. A sedan, maybe 15 years old, dark in color, but with a thin layer of dust that dulled its paint. One of the rear tires looked flat. There were no lights on inside, no hazard lights flashing, and the windows looked black in the glare of my headlights. As I passed it, I caught the faint outline of the driver's door hanging open just a few inches. That bothered me more than it should have. If someone had broken down, they'd either wait inside with the door closed or walk somewhere to get help, not leave it sitting open to the cold night air. I kept driving, but something about that car stuck with me. My mind kept replaying the image of that door, barely open, like someone had stepped out and never came back. A few minutes later, I came around another curve, and my headlights hit something else. This time, it wasn't a car, it was a person. They were standing right at the edge of the road, facing away from me, just on the line where the asphalt met the dirt. No reflective gear, no flashlight, no sign of movement until my beams swept across them, and they turned their heads slightly, just enough for me to see part of their profile. Their clothes were dark, their posture still. I felt my chest tighten in the same way it does when you miss a step on the stairs. I eased the wheel to give them space as I passed, but I didn't slow much. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, but by the time I looked, they were already gone from view. The idea that they were connected to the abandoned car flashed in my head, but I didn't want to think too hard about it. I kept going, telling myself I just needed to reach the next town. The road began to narrow, the trees pushing in closer, their branches forming a kind of arch overhead that swallowed what little starlight there was. My high beams only seemed to make the darkness beyond them thicker. That was when I noticed something in the middle of the road. It was small at first, just a shape that looked out of place, and I slowed down enough to see that it was a backpack. An old, weathered one, slumped on its side like it had been dropped. There was nothing else, no bike, no person, no car. I swerved slightly to avoid it, but my stomach had already twisted into a knot. It didn't feel right. Another mile went by, and the road started climbing into a steeper incline. My headlights swept over a sharp bend ahead, and that's when I saw movement, something darting from one side of the road to the other. I hit the brakes hard, my tires squealing slightly on the pavement. It was the same person, the one I'd seen standing earlier. They moved quickly, vanishing into the trees on the opposite side before my car even rolled to a full stop. My pulse was pounding now, but I didn't get out. I didn't even roll down the window. I pressed my foot back on the gas and kept going, forcing my focus on the center line. The climb ended, and the road flattened into a long, straight stretch. I thought maybe that would calm me, but it didn't. Every shadow beyond the tree line felt like it was holding something. My mirrors showed nothing behind me, but I kept glancing anyway. When the next curve came, I was ready to take it slow. I turned the wheel gently, and my lights swept across another car on the side of the road. My first thought was that it was the same sedan I'd passed earlier, but as I got closer, I saw it wasn't. This one was newer, maybe only a few years old, and it had all 4 doors closed. But the strange part, the part that sent a cold ripple through me, was that the driver's side window was rolled down all the way. The inside was completely dark, and I could see nothing past the glass. My headlights lit up the front half of the car, but the back was swallowed in shadow. I drove past without slowing much, my eyes fixed ahead. The road began to dip downward, and I felt like I was sinking with it. My hands were slick on the steering wheel now, and I noticed I was breathing harder without meaning to. The next curve came sharp, hugging the hillside, and my lights hit something that made my stomach drop. It was another backpack. Not the same one as before. This one was torn, the straps frayed, lying on its back like someone had tried to drag it and given up. I swerved again, my mind spinning now. That made 2 of them, miles apart, and no sign of who they belonged to. I wanted to believe it was just coincidence. Someone had dropped them. A hiker, a traveler, something simple. But the road had no shoulder in most places, no real pull-off spots. It didn't feel like the kind of place people would just leave things. I kept driving, my eyes scanning the edges of the road constantly. My neck felt tight from the tension of not wanting to blink too long. Then, up ahead, I saw the figure again. This time they were in the middle of the road, crouched low like they were picking something up. My brakes came down hard, and the car jolted to a stop a good 20 yards away from them. They didn't move at first. The only sound was my engine, idling louder than it should have. Then they stood slowly, facing me. I couldn't see their face in detail, just the pale oval where it caught the light. We stayed like that for a moment, both of us still. Then they stepped backward into the trees, vanishing into the dark without a sound. I didn't wait. I pressed the gas and went forward, keeping my eyes locked ahead. My heart was thudding, so hard it felt like I could hear it in my ears. The road began to slope upward again, winding in long, slow turns. My gas gauge was dipping lower than I liked, and I still hadn't seen a single sign for a town. The thought of my car stalling out here made my stomach clench. When I came around the next bend, I saw something that nearly made me hit the brakes again. It was a car directly across the road, blocking both lanes. Its headlights were off, and its paint was dark enough to blend almost perfectly into the night. The only reason I saw it in time was because my beams caught the gleam of its windshield. I slowed, but I didn't stop completely. There was just enough space on the shoulder for me to creep past without scraping. As I inched forward, I kept glancing at the car, half expecting someone to step out from behind it. But no one did. Once I cleared it, I pressed harder on the gas. My tires crunched over the gravel edge before finding pavement again, and I didn't look back. For another 20 minutes, I drove without seeing anything else unusual. The trees thinned out, and eventually, faint lights appeared ahead of me. Streetlights, dim and far apart, marking the start of a small town. Only when I reached the first gas station did I pull over. My hands were trembling slightly on the wheel, and I sat there for a moment, staring at my own reflection in the dark glass of the station's window. Whatever had been happening on that road, I didn't want to know more. I filled my tank, got back in the car, and took the highway out of town, choosing a longer route just to make sure I never had to drive that stretch again. I've thought about it since, about the open door, the person on the roadside, the backpacks, the car blocking the road. Each piece on its own might mean nothing, but together, on that silent, empty road, they felt like something I was lucky to have passed through without stopping. It started on a late summer afternoon, the kind where the air feels heavy and still, as if it's holding something back. I had decided to take a long walk in an area I didn't visit much, a stretch of open land that eventually led into a dense patch of woods. The place was far from town, with no houses in sight and only a narrow dirt road leading in. I had been there a few times before, but only during the day and never for more than an hour or two. It wasn't a place people visited often. There were no official trails, just faint paths left by deer or the occasional hiker who had wandered off the beaten track. The sun was beginning to sink lower, and I could feel the light starting to shift, that slow dimming that makes shadows stretch longer and colors turn muted. The dirt road crunched under my shoes until I left it behind and stepped into the grass, moving toward the tree line. The grass here grew tall and uneven, brushing against my legs, carrying the smell of dry earth and faint traces of wild plants. A warm breeze would occasionally move through, but mostly it was still, so still that each step I took felt louder than it should have been. I reached the edge of the woods and stepped inside. The change in temperature hit me immediately, cooler, with a faint dampness to the air. The ground was softer here, covered in old leaves, pine needles, and small twigs that cracked softly under my weight. The smell of the forest was strong, a mix of soil, old wood, and the faint scent of moss. The trees were close together, their branches weaving overhead to create a canopy that let in only thin streaks of light. I followed a faint path, nothing official, just a space where the undergrowth had been pressed down enough to walk through without pushing branches aside. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The sounds of the open land behind me faded until all I could hear was my own movement, the occasional rustle of leaves high above, and once or twice the faint snap of a branch somewhere deeper in the woods. Each sound seemed sharper here, the silence around it making it stand out more. After maybe 20 minutes of walking, I reached a small clearing. The ground was uneven here, with patches of grass between bare spots of dirt. A fallen tree lay to one side, its bark stripped away in places, showing pale wood underneath. I paused there, breathing in the cool air and looking around. It was quiet, but not in the calm, peaceful way you might expect. It was a heavy quiet, the kind that made you feel watched even when you knew no one was there. I couldn't explain why, but I felt uneasy standing there, as if I had walked somewhere I shouldn't have. I turned back toward the path I had come from, ready to head out before it got too dark, but that was when I noticed something odd. The sound I made while walking, my own footsteps on the soft forest floor, seemed to have a slight delay. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I realized it wasn't. I would take a step, and almost a second later, I would hear another faint step from somewhere behind me. I stopped completely, and the forest was silent again. My eyes scanned the trees, searching for movement, but everything was still. I took another slow step forward, deliberately dragging my shoe a little, so I could hear it clearly. The sound came again, soft, muted, but definitely there, almost the same as mine, but not quite in sync. My heartbeat picked up. It could have been an animal, maybe a deer following the path, but the sound felt too precise, too much like someone stepping carefully. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that maybe the sound was echoing off the trees in a strange way, but the unease in my stomach grew. I decided to walk faster, not quite running, but keeping a steady, quick pace back toward the edge of the woods. The faint following sound stayed with me. Each time I stepped, it came again a moment later, as though something was matching my path, but keeping a distance. I resisted the urge to look over my shoulder too often, worried that if I saw something, I wouldn't be able to keep my composure. My breaths grew sharper, and the cool air felt colder now, making the skin on my arms prickle. The path ahead began to look unfamiliar. I was sure I had followed the same way in, but now the trees seemed closer together, and the ground looked different, with more roots and uneven dips in the dirt. I slowed down just enough to check my surroundings, and that was when I heard it again, not just one step this time, but two close together, faster than before. They were closer. I turned my head quickly and caught a flicker of movement, a darker shape between the trees, just at the edge of where the light reached. I couldn't make out a person or an animal, only that something had been there and had moved out of sight the instant I turned. My chest tightened. The forest felt smaller now, pressing in from all sides. I pushed forward, not bothering to stay quiet anymore, letting my footsteps land heavy as I moved. My eyes scanned constantly, trying to pick up any movement ahead or to the sides. Every few seconds, I would hear it again, that faint but distinct sound of something stepping where I had just been, never too close, but never far enough to feel safe. Minutes passed like that, my sense of direction breaking down as I focused more on moving forward than on where exactly I was going. The light in the forest had dimmed further, and the air felt colder still. I could feel sweat at the back of my neck, mixing with the cool air to make me shiver. Then I saw it, the faint light between the trees ahead. It wasn't the open field I had entered from, but it looked like a break in the woods, somewhere I could get out of the dense cover. I moved faster, almost jogging now, my bag shifting slightly on my back with each step. The sounds behind me kept pace, never rushing, just following. When I reached the opening, I found myself at the edge of a steep drop. Below was a shallow ravine, its bottom filled with rocks and a narrow stream of water. The other side rose sharply, covered in more trees. There was no easy way down without risking a fall. My only option was to turn and find another path, but the thought of going back into the woods in that direction made my stomach turn. The following steps were gone now. The silence was thick, so complete it made my ears ring. I stood there for a few seconds, frozen, waiting for a sound, any sound. That was when I caught it again, just one step this time, off to my left, closer than before. My eyes locked on that direction, but nothing moved. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the spot. My foot slipped slightly on loose dirt near the edge, sending a few small stones tumbling down into the ravine. The sound echoed faintly, then faded. I could feel my pulse in my neck. I turned sharply and started moving along the edge, looking for any sign of the original path out. After what felt like forever, I found a slope that led up and away from the ravine, the ground rising toward what I hoped was the edge of the forest. My legs burned as I climbed, and my breath came fast, but I didn't stop. The trees began to thin, and soon I could see the faint glow of open land beyond them. I pushed through the last of the branches and stepped into the tall grass again. I stopped there, looking back at the dark wall of trees. Nothing moved. No sound followed me out. The field was quiet except for the faint rustle of grass in the wind. My breathing slowed gradually, but my skin still felt tight, my senses sharpened as if expecting something to appear. I walked quickly across the open land, not looking back again until I reached the dirt road. From there, I could see the woods in the distance, the shadows between the trees already blending into one dark mass as the last of the light faded. I stood for a moment, staring at that edge, wondering if I had been followed by someone or if my mind had twisted natural sounds into something else entirely. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. The sound of those steps had been too deliberate, too perfectly timed to my own. Someone, or something, had been there, moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped, always staying just far enough away to keep hidden. I left without stopping again, and even as I reached the safety of my home later, the image of that dark shape between the trees stayed with me. I never went back to that part of the woods, and even now, years later, if I walk alone in a quiet place and hear a sound just a little too similar to my own footsteps, my chest tightens, and I remember exactly how it felt to be followed in those silent woods, with no idea what was behind me and no one around to help. It started as a normal day, nothing strange at all. I woke up late that morning and spent most of the afternoon at home, cleaning up, making food, and scrolling on my phone. The weather was calm, slightly overcast, but not threatening rain. Around 5 in the evening, I decided I wanted to get outside for a while before it got dark. I thought about going for a walk, but the usual routes around my neighborhood had started to feel too familiar. I wanted something quieter, something away from traffic and people. There was an old service road just outside of town, a narrow gravel path that led into a patch of woodland. It wasn't marked as private, but it didn't seem like many people went there. The last time I'd been there was years ago, but I remembered it being peaceful, with tall trees blocking most of the wind and a faint smell of pine in the air. I thought it would be perfect for clearing my head, so I grabbed my light jacket, filled a bottle of water, and set off. By the time I reached the entrance to the service road, the sun was already starting to dip. The light had that soft, low glow, filtering through the trees and making long shadows across the gravel. The first few hundred feet were open, with thin grass growing along the sides, but soon the trees thickened and closed in overhead, dulling the daylight even more. I kept walking, my shoes crunching on the gravel, the sound echoing faintly in the stillness. There were no cars, no voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves when a breeze passed through. The deeper I went, the narrower the path felt. The gravel gave way to dirt in some spots, where rain had washed it away. A small drainage ditch ran along one side, full of dark water and fallen branches. I passed a pile of old logs, stacked as if someone had meant to come back for them years ago, but never did. The smell of damp earth was strong here, almost heavy, and the air had that still, pressing feeling you get when you're far from any open space. I kept telling myself I'd turn back when I reached the clearing I remembered from years ago, a small open area with a few big flat rocks where I used to sit. I thought I saw it up ahead, but as I kept walking, the path seemed longer than I remembered. The sun was dropping faster now, and the dim light in the woods made it harder to judge distances. That's when I noticed something strange. Somewhere behind me, faint but clear, there was the sound of a single footstep. Not the crunch of a squirrel or the snap of a twig under an animal's paw. This was slower, heavier. It came from somewhere back along the path I had just walked, but when I stopped and turned, there was nothing there. Just the trees, the ditch, and the winding path disappearing into shadow. I told myself it could have been anything. Maybe a branch falling. Maybe my own foot kicking a loose stone that rolled a little too far. Still, the sound had been too distinct. I tried to shake it off and kept walking, but I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often now. The path bent slightly, and the clearing finally came into view. Relief washed over me. The rocks were there, just as I remembered, with a bit of moss growing on them. I stepped into the open space, set down my water bottle, and took a deep breath. I thought I might sit for a moment before heading back, but as I crouched down, I heard it again, this time clearer. A slow, deliberate step. Then another. The sound was closer now. I stood up quickly and scanned the trees, my heartbeat already picking up. The space between the trunks was dense, but not so dense that I couldn't see a fair distance. Yet there was no movement. No flash of an animal darting away. No person stepping into view. Just stillness. I told myself I wasn't going to panic. I picked up my bottle, tightened the strap on my jacket, and started heading back. I kept my pace steady, not wanting to seem like I was running from nothing, but every sense in my body was tuned to the sound of the ground beneath me and the space behind me. About 50 yards into my return, I heard it again. One step, then a pause. Whoever, or whatever, it was, they were matching my movement, but staying just far enough back to avoid being seen. My mouth went dry. I didn't want to turn around again, afraid of what I might, or might not see. The path was twisting more than I remembered. Every bend in the trail made me nervous, because each time I rounded a curve, I couldn't see more than a few steps ahead. The light was dimming fast now, the sky above turning a dull gray blue. I decided to pick up my pace, letting the sound of my footsteps cover the noise from behind. But even then, I caught faint hints of movement in the pauses between my own steps. Sometimes it was the crunch of dirt, sometimes the faint swish of something brushing against low branches. The air was cooler now, and my breath came out in faint clouds. My hands were cold, even inside my jacket pockets. I glanced to my right and saw that the drainage ditch had widened and deepened, the water darker and more stagnant. The smell of wet decay from rotting leaves was strong, almost sour. Then, without warning, there was a sharper sound, a quick shift in weight, like someone adjusting their stance after landing from a small drop. It was close, too close. My body reacted before my mind had a chance to catch up. I broke into a run. The dirt slipped under my shoes in a few places, forcing me to throw my arms out to keep balance. My breathing grew loud and harsh, echoing in my ears. The path seemed endless, twisting and dipping, my legs burning as I pushed harder. Behind me, I thought I could hear a faint rhythm, footsteps matching mine, then fading, then catching up again. It didn't make sense. If it was an animal, it should have either charged or fled by now. If it was a person, they weren't calling out, weren't asking for help or telling me to stop. They were just following. I don't know how long I ran before I finally saw the break in the trees ahead. The pale light of the open road came into view, and I pushed harder, my lungs aching. The moment my feet hit the gravel at the start of the service road, I didn't stop. I ran all the way to my car, yanked the door open, and slammed it shut behind me. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my chest heaving. I stared at the mouth of the path for what felt like minutes, waiting to see if anything, or anyone, would emerge. Nothing did. The woods just stood there, quiet and still, as if nothing had happened. I drove home with my hands shaking on the wheel, checking my mirrors far more than I should have. Even after I got inside my house and locked the door, I couldn't stop replaying the sounds in my head. Those slow, deliberate steps. The way they always seemed just far enough back to keep me from seeing the source. I haven't gone back to that path since. I still don't know who, or what, was behind me that evening. Maybe it was just someone else walking the same trail, keeping their distance for their own reasons. But deep down, I know it wasn't that simple. The timing, the way they matched my pace, the complete silence except for the steps. It wasn't the behavior of someone out for a stroll. It was the behavior of someone who didn't want to be seen, but also didn't want me to leave. And that's the part that keeps me up at night. It was the middle of summer, and the heat had been unbearable for days. I had taken some time off work to get away from the noise and routine, deciding to spend a few days in a remote place I knew about. A friend had told me about an old and used ranger station deep in the hills, miles away from the nearest small town. It wasn't locked up, and no one seemed to care if someone stayed there. It was basic, just 4 wooden walls, a roof, and an old cot inside, but it was quiet, far from anyone, and surrounded by endless forest. That was all I wanted. I packed light, a sleeping bag, some food, a flashlight, and a small camping stove. The idea of being completely alone didn't bother me. In fact, it was part of the appeal. The road to the place was little more than a dirt track, and I had to park my car nearly 2 miles away where the path became too narrow and overgrown for vehicles. The rest of the way I hiked on foot, the air thick and heavy with the smell of pine and hot earth. I could hear insects buzzing in the undergrowth, and every so often, a faint rustle of something moving away as I passed. I tried not to think about snakes. My boots crunched over dry twigs, the sound sharp in the quiet. After about 40 minutes, I reached the small clearing where the station stood. The wood was weathered and gray, the roof sagging a little at one corner, but it looked solid enough. I stepped inside and was hit by a strong smell of dry dust and old wood. It was cooler inside, shaded from the sun. There was nothing much to the interior. One room, an old cot with a thin mattress against the wall, and a couple of shelves with a few rusted cans that I wouldn't dare eat from. I dropped my pack and stood there for a moment listening. Nothing but the low hum of insects outside. No cars, no people, not even the sound of wind. It was so still that I could hear my own breathing. I unpacked my gear slowly, trying to adjust to the stillness. The quiet had a weight to it. The first day passed without much happening. I walked the trails nearby, boiled some water for tea, and watched the sun set through the trees. When night came, the heat dropped fast, and I zipped myself into my sleeping bag. Lying there in the dark, I could hear the occasional snap of branches outside, probably deer, I told myself. Every sound seemed sharper in the silence. I drifted in and out of sleep, waking a few times to the sound of something moving around in the clearing. I told myself it was just animals, but each time, I found myself holding my breath until the noise faded away. The second day, I decided to explore farther from the station. I followed a trail that wound up into higher ground, giving me a view of the endless forest below. I saw no one, not a single hiker, no distant voices, no sign of anyone. When I came back in the late afternoon, I noticed something odd near the clearing. There were boot prints in the dirt, fresh ones. They were coming from the direction of the trail I had taken, leading toward the station. My first thought was that maybe someone had been passing by while I was gone, maybe a hunter or another hiker. But the track stopped just a few feet from the door, and there were no prints leading away. I crouched down, looking closely. The prints were sharp, the edges of the tread still clean. Whoever it was had been there not long ago. I told myself it didn't matter, but the thought stuck in my head. That night, I lay awake longer than before, listening harder. The forest seemed quieter than usual, like the insects had pulled back. At some point, I thought I heard the faint sound of footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, circling the station. I didn't move. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I waited for the sound to pass, but it didn't. It just stopped. The silence after was worse than the sound itself. Eventually, I must have drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to find more footprints in the dirt, fresher than before, right under the window. I hadn't heard anyone walk away. The forest was the same as ever, calm, still, pretending nothing had happened. I walked the perimeter, checking the tree line, but saw nothing. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but it was early, and the rational part of me told myself I was overreacting. I tried to distract myself with small chores, boiling water, sweeping out some of the dust inside. That afternoon, I heard something from the trees. It wasn't an animal sound, it was too rhythmic. It came in short bursts, like someone moving carefully, but not fast. I froze, my hand resting on the edge of the table inside. The sound stopped as soon as I stilled. Minutes passed. Then, from much closer, I heard a faint scraping, like metal against wood. I turned slowly toward the window. Nothing there. The sound came again, this time from the other side of the station, but when I stepped toward the door, it stopped. The stillness after made my skin prickle. When night fell, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The air outside seemed heavier, the forest darker than before. I kept the flashlight close, but I didn't want to use it too much. It made me feel more visible. I lay in my sleeping bag, eyes open, barely breathing. Hours passed. Then I heard it, slow steps in the dirt just outside. This time, they didn't circle. They stopped right at the wall beside my cot. I could hear the faint shift of weight in the boards of the porch outside. Whoever it was just stood there. I didn't move. My breathing was shallow, my hands clenched tight under the blanket. The steps started again, moving toward the door, pausing there for what felt like forever. Then nothing. I stayed awake the rest of the night, ears straining for the smallest sound. When morning came, I stepped outside to see the prints again. The same tread pattern, now more of them, all around the station. They were spaced in a way that told me whoever it was had been moving slowly, stopping often. The thought of them standing there in the dark, so close to me, made my stomach turn. I decided I wasn't going to spend another night there. I packed my things quickly, my eyes flicking constantly to the tree line. The hike back to my car felt longer than before. Every sound from the forest made me turn my head. Once I thought I saw movement between the trees, just a brief flicker of something pale, like a face. But when I stopped, there was nothing. I walked faster, my hands damp with sweat. When I finally reached the car, I threw my pack inside and locked the doors before starting the engine. I looked up at the trail one last time. The forest stood there, still and silent, hiding whatever had been out there. I drove away without stopping until I was back on the main road. I never saw another car the whole time. By the time I reached town, my shoulders ached from how tense I had been. Even now, I can't explain who it was or why they had been there watching me. I just know that if I had stayed one more night, something worse than footprints might have been left behind. And the thought that whoever it was is still out there, somewhere in those woods, keeps me from ever wanting to go back. It started out as a simple day, one of those where nothing feels unusual or dangerous. The weather was mild, the sky a washed-out blue, and the air had that faint smell of dry grass that usually came in late summer. I had planned to spend the afternoon walking through a stretch of land I'd driven past many times, but never explored. It wasn't marked as a park or anything official, just a patchwork of tall grass, scrub trees, and a few small dirt trails that wound into the hills. I parked my car near the edge of the road where a faint trail dipped down into a shallow gully. From there, the land rolled gently away, the grass shifting like waves in the light breeze. The first 100 yards felt almost pleasant, with the crunch of dirt under my shoes and the warm sun on my back. There was nothing around but the faint hum of insects and the occasional sound of a bird in the distance. The trail dipped further, eventually pulling me into a hollow where the grass grew taller. Some stalks reached up to my chest, and walking became a bit slower as I pushed them aside. The ground here was softer, almost spongy in places, as if water had pooled here earlier in the season. The air grew still, and I realized that the sound of the breeze had faded completely. Even the insects seemed quieter. I kept going, thinking I'd circle back to the road from a different angle. That was when I noticed faint impressions in the dirt along the edge of the trail. Not boot prints, not tire marks, but something more irregular. The shape was wide, the edges rounded, and they were pressed deep into the soft soil. I crouched to look closer and saw that there were several of them, spaced unevenly, leading in the same direction I was walking. They didn't look old. The edges were crisp, and a bit of loose dirt still crumbled inward from the pressure. I followed them without thinking much about it, more curious than concerned. After about 50 yards, the trail thinned, and the prints veered off into the grass. I stopped, scanning ahead, and saw that the ground sloped up sharply toward a line of trees I hadn't noticed before. The trees were dense and their trunks twisted, their lower branches reaching low over the grass. Something about the way the shadows pooled there made me hesitate, but the prints kept going straight toward them. The closer I got, the more the air seemed heavier. The grass rustled faintly, though there was still no breeze. I could hear my own breathing loud in my ears. As I stepped between the first two trees, the light dimmed, and the sound of the outside world faded even more. The air here was cooler, damp, and smelled faintly of something musky, like wet earth mixed with the scent of an animal enclosure. The ground was uneven, covered in a mix of leaves and patches of bare earth. The prints were clearer here, more defined. I noticed now that they weren't all the same size. Some were slightly smaller, others larger. That realization made my stomach tighten. Whatever had made them, there was more than one. I moved slowly, trying to listen for any movement ahead, but the forest was silent. Even my footsteps seemed absorbed by the damp ground. A few yards ahead, the prints curved sharply around a large fallen tree. I stepped over it, the bark damp under my hand, and as I straightened up, I caught a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. I froze. It was just a shape at first, low to the ground, moving between two tree trunks. The color blended almost perfectly with the surroundings, but the slight shift gave it away. I couldn't make out details, just that it was large, much larger than I expected. I waited, not moving, hoping whatever it was would keep going. But instead, it stopped too. I couldn't see it fully, but I felt the weight of its attention, as if it was aware of me now and deciding what to do about it. My skin prickled, and I realized my breathing had gone shallow. Then slowly it moved again, but this time it was closer. I stepped backward as quietly as I could, feeling the damp leaves under my shoes. My eyes scanned for an easier way out, but the trees were thick and the undergrowth tangled. Every step I took seemed to make more noise than I wanted. The smell in the air was stronger now, sharp and animal-like. My pulse was hammering. I didn't dare turn my back completely, but I had to put more distance between me and whatever was moving toward me. I kept stepping back until my heel caught on something, and I stumbled slightly, catching myself against a tree trunk. The bark scraped my palm, but I barely noticed. My eyes flicked around, and that was when I saw it fully for the first time, far enough away that I couldn't make out every detail, but close enough to understand what I was looking at. It was on all fours, but its back was level with my waist. Its body was lean but muscular, the shape of its shoulders pronounced as it moved. Its head was low, its eyes fixed in my direction. The fur was patchy in places, matted, and the mouth hung slightly open. I could see the glint of teeth even in the dim light. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and started moving as quickly as I could without breaking into a full run, trying to keep my steps quiet. But the sound behind me changed. The soft padding on leaves was faster now. I knew it was following. I broke into a run, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was in my throat. Branches whipped at my arms and face as I tried to stay upright on the uneven ground. I didn't dare look back. Every instinct told me to get out of the trees as fast as possible. The light ahead grew brighter, and I pushed harder until I burst out of the tree line and into the open grass. I kept running, my legs burning, glancing over my shoulder just once. I didn't see it anymore, but the grass behind me was moving in a ripple, something passing through it quickly. I didn't stop until I saw the road and my car parked at the edge. My hands shook as I yanked the door open and got inside, slamming the lock down. My breathing was ragged, my shirt clinging to me with sweat. For a long moment, I just sat there, watching the grass and the edge of the trees. Nothing came out. The wind had picked up again, and the sound of it in the grass almost masked any other noise. Almost. As I pulled onto the road, I realized I hadn't heard a single bird or insect since stepping into those trees. I drove faster than I should have, glancing in the mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see movement behind me. By the time I reached a busier stretch of road, my hands had stopped trembling, but the smell of that musky air still lingered in my nose. It stayed with me the rest of the day, faint but constant, as if I'd carried some part of that place back with me. That night, when I finally lay down, my mind replayed the sight of it, low to the ground, shoulders shifting, eyes locked on me. I told myself it was just an animal, something that lived out there, and didn't mean to cross paths with me. But even now, weeks later, when I pass that stretch of land, I keep my eyes on the road and my windows up. The grass still sways in the wind the same way, but I can't help imagining the ripple of something moving beneath it, waiting for the right moment to step into view. It started as just another drive, nothing special, nothing worth remembering. I had been on the road since early morning, heading toward a small town several hours away to deliver some documents for work. I decided to take a back road instead of sticking to the main highway, mostly because I wanted a change of scenery and I thought it would be quicker. The road wound through thick stretches of forest, the kind where trees grew so close together their branches overlapped above the road like a tunnel. The asphalt was old, with cracks spreading in every direction and faded lines that were barely visible. Every few minutes, I'd pass a bend where the forest closed in even tighter, and the sunlight faded until it was little more than a dim glow between the leaves. It was late afternoon when I first started to get the uneasy feeling. The kind that creeps up slowly, without any real reason, and just sits in the back of your mind. I kept driving, telling myself it was nothing, but I realized I hadn't passed another car for almost 40 minutes. No houses, no gas stations, not even a driveway. Just endless trees and the faint sound of my tires on the road. My phone sat in the cup holder, and I noticed the signal bar had dropped to nothing a while back. That made me uneasy too, but I tried to brush it off. The road dipped and curved sharply to the right, and as I came around the bend, I saw something up ahead. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer, standing near the edge of the road. But as I got closer, I realized it was a man. He stood just inside the tree line, half hidden in the shadows, facing the road. His clothes looked dirty, like he'd been outside for days. He didn't move as I passed, just stood there watching. I didn't slow down. I didn't want to. My eyes flicked to the mirror as soon as I cleared the bend, but by the time I looked back, he was gone. For a few miles, I kept scanning the sides of the road, half expecting to see him again. The feeling in my gut was heavier now, an instinctive warning that something wasn't right. I wanted to drive faster, but the road was narrow, and I didn't know how sharp the turns would be ahead. The air inside the car felt warmer, heavier, like the windows were locked shut even though they were open an inch. A few minutes later, I saw a small pull-off on the right side of the road, a patch of gravel just wide enough for one car. I slowed, thinking I could stop for a moment to stretch my legs and drink some water. As soon as I put my foot on the brake, I caught sight of something in the mirror. Far behind me, maybe 100 yards back, someone was walking along the edge of the road. I didn't know if it was the same man from before, but my chest tightened at the sight. He wasn't walking toward me. He was walking in the same direction I was going, slow and steady, like he had all the time in the world. I pressed the gas again and kept moving. My water bottle stayed untouched on the seat. I didn't look back for several miles, but when I finally did, there was no one there. Still, I couldn't shake the thought of him, and every shadow between the trees seemed deeper, darker, like something could be hiding in them. The sun had dropped lower now, and the road was even dimmer. In the fading light, everything looked different, less familiar, even though I'd just passed it. I checked the clock on the dash. I should have been out of the forest by now, or at least close, but it felt like I was going in circles. The same cracked asphalt, the same leaning pine trees, the same long stretches without a single sign of life. My stomach knotted tighter. Then my low fuel light came on. The orange glow on the dash felt like a warning I couldn't ignore. I hadn't seen a gas station since before I turned onto this road, and now I started to realize how deep into nowhere I really was. I slowed at each curve, hoping I'd see a driveway, a building, anything, but there was nothing. Just trees, shadows, and the sound of my engine. I came around another bend and saw something that made my skin crawl. Off to the side, in a small clearing, there was an old truck. Its paint was faded, and it sat at an angle like one of its tires was flat. The hood was open, and the driver's door hung wide. It didn't look abandoned, not completely. The air felt different as I passed it, like the forest was holding its breath. I kept my eyes forward, but in my peripheral vision, I thought I saw movement in the shadows beyond the truck. My foot pressed harder on the gas without me thinking about it. The next 10 minutes felt longer than the whole drive so far. Every bend looked the same. Every hill dropped into another stretch of empty road. My fuel gauge kept sinking, and I started to realize I couldn't keep going forever. I needed to stop somewhere, but stopping out here felt like the worst possible thing I could do. Finally, I saw a break in the trees ahead. It wasn't a town, just a small dirt road branching off to the right. I slowed down, thinking maybe it led to a farmhouse or a cabin. The turn was sharp, and as soon as I started down it, I knew it was a mistake. The road was little more than 2 ruts in the dirt, the trees pressing in even closer than before. Branches scraped the sides of the car, and the ground was uneven. I drove for maybe half a minute before realizing it didn't open up at all. There was no sign of any building, just more woods. I stopped and put the car in reverse, my eyes flicking to the mirrors. That's when I saw him. He was standing at the mouth of the dirt road, back on the pavement, blocking the way out. I couldn't see his face in the dim light, but I could see the shape of him, tall, shoulders slightly hunched, not moving. My hands clenched the steering wheel. I didn't know how long he'd been standing there, but the thought that he might have followed me sent a cold wave through my chest. I didn't move. Neither did he. The forest around us was silent, no birds, no insects, just the faint tick of my cooling engine. My heart thudded so loud I could feel it in my neck. I tried to tell myself I could just wait, that maybe he'd leave, but every second felt heavier, pressing me to act. Without thinking it through, I threw the car into drive and jerked the wheel to the left, aiming straight toward the trees off the dirt road. Branches snapped against the hood as I forced my way through, the car bouncing over roots and rocks. I kept going until I couldn't see the road anymore. My hands shook on the wheel, my breath coming fast. When I finally stopped, I turned off the headlights. The forest swallowed me whole. I sat there in the dark, listening, waiting. For a long time, there was nothing, just the sound of my breathing and the occasional creak of the cooling engine. Then, faintly, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving somewhere behind me. I stayed still, every muscle locked, gripping the steering wheel as if that would keep me safe. The footsteps stopped. Minutes passed. I didn't move. I didn't start the car. I just waited, the darkness pressing in, knowing that somewhere out there, he was still standing in the trees, waiting too. By the time I finally worked up the nerve to drive out, hours had passed, and the forest was completely black. I never saw him again, but every mile I put between myself and those woods felt like I was escaping something I wasn't supposed to survive. Even now, I don't know if it was all in my head, or if he was really following me. But I do know this: when a place makes every instinct you have screamed to leave, you should listen. Because out there, in the empty stretches where no one can hear you, there are things worse than getting lost. I woke up earlier than usual that morning, the kind of early where the air feels colder than it should, and the light hasn't fully settled into the day yet. My apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of the fridge and the occasional creak from the walls. I made a quick breakfast, barely tasting it, and packed my small backpack with a bottle of water, some snacks, a flashlight, and my phone. I had planned to go out for a long walk through the outskirts of town where the fields start to thin out into woodland. I liked those areas because they were far from traffic, and the air always smelled cleaner. The walk started out calm. The early morning chill stayed with me as I followed the cracked sidewalk out of the neighborhood and into the gravel road that cut through open space. The sky was pale blue, clouds stretched thin like worn fabric, and the ground was still damp from rain the night before. I could smell wet soil, a scent that always reminded me of being out on trails as a kid. After about half an hour, I reached the old dirt path that led deeper into the tree line. The grass on either side was high and tangled, brushing against my jeans as I walked. The trees were tall and spaced far apart at first, letting in shafts of sunlight, but I knew from past walks that they would close in soon. The deeper you went, the quieter it became. At first, it was peaceful. The sound of my boots crunching on the dirt, the faint rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird I couldn't identify. It all blended into something steady and relaxing. I followed the bends of the path, noticing small details I'd missed before. The way a moss-covered log curved into the shadows, the way the bark on some trees peeled in long strips, the dark, rich smell of wet wood. But somewhere further in, I noticed how different it felt compared to the start. The air seemed heavier. The path looked narrower, though I knew it was just the trees closing in. Even the light was dimmer here, more filtered, as if the sun had decided to keep its distance. A mile or so in, I heard the first sound that didn't fit. It wasn't loud, just a faint crack somewhere behind me. I stopped walking and listened, turning my head slightly. Nothing else followed. It could have been a branch falling or an animal moving through the brush, but it was enough to make me more aware of each sound around me. I walked on, slower now, my ears tuned to the silence between steps. I noticed another thing. There was no wind. The leaves didn't move. Not even the smallest ones. It was just still. My own breathing felt louder than it should have been, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, even though I didn't see anything there. A few minutes later, I came across a fork in the path. I had never gone to the right before. It looked less worn, with more overgrowth and less dirt showing through. I almost took the left, the usual route, but something in me decided to try the other way. The moment I stepped onto it, the air seemed even thicker. The sound of my footsteps was duller here, as though the ground was swallowing it. The new path curved sharply after only a short distance, and once I rounded that bend, I couldn't see where I had come from. The trees were packed tighter, and the undergrowth was thicker, almost knee-high in places. I slowed again, scanning the spaces between the trunks. That's when I heard it. The faint sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, crushing leaves and twigs, coming from somewhere behind me. I froze, listening hard. They stopped too. I waited, not moving, my eyes locked on the shadows ahead while my ears stayed focused behind. After a moment, I forced myself to keep walking, this time without looking back. My skin prickled with every step. The path dipped slightly, leading into a low area where the light was almost gone. The smell here was different, stale, damp, with a hint of rot, like something had been sitting in water too long. I stepped carefully around a patch of mud, noticing a set of footprints that weren't mine. They were faint but fresh, pressed into the softer earth, going in the same direction I was heading. They looked like boot prints, larger than mine, the tread deep enough to show detail. Something in me tightened. I hadn't seen anyone else since leaving the main road, and this path didn't seem like one people used often. I kept moving, but my pace was slower now, each step measured. The trees leaned closer together ahead, forming a sort of tunnel. I could see how the shadows pooled inside it, making it hard to see more than a few yards forward. As I entered, the air felt cooler, but not in a refreshing way. It was the kind of cold that settles on your skin and stays there. The sound of footsteps returned, closer now, matching my pace. I didn't turn. I didn't want to see how close they might be. My heart was beating faster, my grip tightening on the straps of my backpack. Then somewhere to my right, a branch snapped loudly. It wasn't the thin crack of a twig. It was the heavy break of wood under real weight. I stopped breathing for a second, straining to hear movement after it. I caught a faint sound of something shifting through the brush, slow and careful. I knew it wasn't a deer. Deer don't move like that. I kept going, quicker now, my eyes scanning for any sign of the path opening up ahead. But the trees just kept closing in, the ground more uneven. My boots sank slightly in patches of damp soil, leaving clear impressions. I felt exposed even though I was surrounded by trees. The thought of someone following me here, in this kind of silence, settled into my stomach like a weight. Finally, I saw what looked like a clearing through the branches ahead. I pushed toward it, moving faster now. But as I stepped into it, I realized it wasn't the kind of clearing I wanted. It was small, enclosed by trees on all sides except for the way I came in. The ground was bare here, no grass, just packed dirt and scattered stones. I stopped in the center, turning slowly to take it in. That's when I saw movement at the edge where I had entered, a shadow slipping back behind a tree. My chest tightened. Whoever it was, they weren't hiding well. They wanted me to know they were there. I didn't waste any more time. I walked quickly back toward the path I'd come from, keeping my eyes forward, not on the spot where the movement had been. My legs felt stiff, my breathing uneven. As soon as I reached the bend, I pushed my pace faster, almost jogging now. I could hear them behind me, the sound of footsteps matching mine again. Not running, just steady. The path seemed longer going back. Every turn looked like the last, and I couldn't tell how far I was from the main fork. My mouth was dry, and my shoulders ached from keeping my backpack strapped so tight. When I finally saw the original fork, relief hit me, but I didn't slow down. I took the left path, the one I knew, moving fast. My boots kicked up dirt and small stones, my breath loud in my ears. The trees started to thin after a while, letting in more light, and I could see the faint outline of the open fields ahead. I didn't stop until I was out of the trees and back on the gravel road. Only then did I glance behind me, but there was nothing, just the narrow path disappearing into the shadows. I stood there for a while, catching my breath, listening for any sound that didn't belong. Nothing came. No movement. No footsteps. Just the quiet hum of the open air around me. I walked the rest of the way home without looking back again. But even after I locked my door and sat down in my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling. Whoever had been out there hadn't been lost, hadn't been wandering. They had followed me on purpose, staying just close enough to let me know they were there. And the worst part was knowing that they never tried to catch me. They didn't need to. They'd seen me, and now they knew I'd been there too. I woke up that morning feeling restless, like my body was telling me I needed to get out and move. I had been spending too much time indoors, stuck in a loop of work, eating, and sleep. So, I decided I would go for a long walk, somewhere quiet, away from the noise and clutter of people. I drove out of the city until I found a rural road that ran along a stretch of woods I had never explored before. It wasn't an official hiking spot, just a thin dirt pull-off on the side of the road where I could park my car. There was a rough-looking trail leading into the trees, probably made by hunters or locals who knew the area better than I did. I figured I could just walk until I felt I had gone far enough, and then turn back. The air smelled damp the moment I stepped into the shade of the forest. The ground was soft from recent rain, and small puddles reflected patches of gray sky where the trees opened up above me. The path was narrow and overgrown in some spots, with ferns brushing against my legs and the occasional vine hanging low enough that I had to duck. I could hear nothing but the sound of my own footsteps and the faint rustle of leaves overhead. There was no wind, but every now and then a drop of water from the last rainfall would fall from a branch, landing with a soft tap on my jacket or in the dirt beside me. The deeper I went, the less I could hear the distant hum of cars from the road. Eventually, it faded completely, leaving only the forest sounds. Small birds calling to each other, the dry crack of a branch somewhere far off, and the faint buzzing of insects. The stillness was calming at first, almost peaceful, but after a while it started to feel a little too quiet, like I had stepped somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. The trail was barely visible now, broken up by patches of mud and fallen leaves that made it hard to tell where it actually went. I had to keep scanning ahead to spot where the ground looked the most worn down by feet. I don't know how far I had gone when I started noticing the subtle changes. The trees here seemed taller and closer together, their trunks darker, their branches tangled high above, blocking out more of the sky. The air felt heavier, cooler. The smell of damp earth was stronger, mixed with something faintly metallic. I told myself it was probably just the scent of wet leaves rotting on the ground. I kept walking, trying to convince myself that I'd turn back soon, but every time I thought about it, I saw another stretch of trail ahead and wanted to see where it led. It was when I came to the ridge that I stopped for the first time in a while. The ground sloped sharply upward on my left, rising about 15 or 20 feet before leveling out. The trail curved along the base of it, so I kept moving, glancing up every so often at the top. That's when I saw movement. It was faint and quick, just a dark shape passing between two trees up on the ridge. I froze, waiting to see it again, but the space between the trunks stayed empty. I thought it might have been a deer, or maybe just a trick of my eyes, the way shadows shift when you're tired. Still, something about the shape had looked deliberate. Not animal-like in the way it moved, more like a person, walking steadily. I kept going, my ears straining for any sound from above, but all I heard was the distant call of a crow. The ridge stayed with me for a while before eventually sloping down until it was level with the path. I thought about climbing up to look around, but decided against it. The light in the forest was already dim, and I didn't want to lose my sense of direction. A little later, I decided to gather some fallen branches to bring home for the fire pit in my backyard. I stepped off the trail to grab a thick piece of wood and noticed the ground here was different, softer, almost like it had been disturbed. There were scuffs in the dirt, not quite footprints, but marks that suggested something heavy had moved through. I crouched down to get a better look, brushing away leaves. The soil beneath was damp and dark, with shallow impressions that seemed to follow a rough line deeper into the trees. I straightened up, scanning the forest. That's when I heard it, slow, deep breathing. It wasn't close at first, more like it was drifting in from somewhere just out of sight. My own breath felt loud in my ears, so I held it, trying to pick up the rhythm. It was definitely breathing. Inhale, pause, exhale. Heavy, deliberate. I turned my head toward the sound, my eyes searching between the trunks. For a moment, I thought I caught the faintest shift of movement, something slipping between two trees, low to the ground. The breathing grew fainter, like it was moving away, but the way it echoed in the stillness made it impossible to tell exactly where it was. My pulse was hammering now. I told myself it could be an animal, maybe a boar or a large dog. But I knew the difference between the short, sharp breaths of a startled animal and the slow, steady pattern I had just heard. This was something else. I turned back toward the trail, trying to remember exactly where it was. Even though I hadn't gone far off, the undergrowth made it harder to see. Every tree looked the same, and the air felt colder now. I moved quickly, my boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. The forest felt different now, less like a peaceful escape, and more like it was closing in. The shadows between the trees seemed thicker, and every faint noise made me flinch. When I finally spotted the trail again, I felt a surge of relief, but it didn't last long. As I stepped back onto it, I caught a faint sound from behind me, a branch snapping. Not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the background noise. I didn't stop to look. My legs were moving before I had even thought about it, my stride lengthening into a fast walk. The trail was uneven, roots sticking up like traps waiting to catch my foot, but I kept going, focusing on putting as much distance between myself and whatever was back there as I could. My breathing grew loud, my chest tightening with each step, but I didn't slow down. I could hear something faint behind me now, not footsteps exactly, but the suggestion of movement, a rhythm that seemed to match mine. I kept my eyes on the winding path ahead, trying to remember landmarks from the way in. The forest looked different coming back, and for a moment I thought I had taken a wrong turn. But then I spotted a fallen tree I had stepped over earlier, and I knew I was still on the right track. The closer I got to where I had parked, the lighter the air seemed to get. The trees began to thin, and patches of pale sky showed through the branches. Still, I didn't let myself slow down until I could see my car through the last line of trees. I didn't look back. I unlocked the door, slid inside, and started the engine with hands that felt clumsy on the keys. As I pulled out onto the road, I kept my eyes forward, the forest shrinking in my rearview mirror. Even when I was miles away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me the whole time, staying just far enough back to never be seen fully. When I got home, I locked the door and closed the curtains. My clothes still smelled faintly of damp earth, and every time I caught the scent, I felt my shoulders tighten. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe I had spooked myself over some animal moving in the woods. But part of me knew that wasn't true. There had been intent in that breathing, a slow, measured presence that stayed with me until I left. I haven't been back to that trail since. Sometimes, though, when I'm outside at night and the air is still, I remember that sound in the forest and the way it seemed to follow me. And I wonder if it ever stopped, or if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to wander far enough in. It was late in the afternoon when I left the small roadside diner. The air outside felt heavier than usual, warm and damp, the kind of humidity that clings to your skin. The sky had been gray all day, not stormy, but dull, like it had given up trying to decide whether to rain or clear up. My plan was simple: drive a few hours north to reach a cheap motel I had looked up the night before. I was behind schedule, though. The detour for lunch had taken longer than I expected, and my phone battery was already low. I didn't have a car charger. I figured I'd be fine since the motel was supposed to be easy to find from the main road. The first stretch of road was uneventful, just the hum of the tires against cracked asphalt and the occasional blur of farmland. As I drove, the road began to narrow, the fields giving way to scattered trees, then thicker patches of woods. I kept my eyes on the fading light. The sun was sliding behind the hills, and shadows stretched longer across the road. About 40 minutes later, my phone died completely. I wasn't too concerned at first, but without the map, I realized how many little roads branched off from the main one. The signs were small, worn down, and sometimes missing entirely. I started relying on memory, but after another half hour, I couldn't be sure if I'd taken a wrong turn or not. The trees closed in tighter, and the road began to curve more sharply. There were no houses, no gas stations, no cars passing in either direction. Just the sound of my engine echoing against the walls of forest. Eventually, I spotted a small dirt pull-off with an old wooden post that had once held a sign, but the metal plate was gone. I slowed down, debating whether to stop. It was then that I noticed the gas gauge, lower than I thought. I hadn't filled up in hours. I kept driving, more tense now. The last trace of daylight was gone, replaced by a deep, hazy blue that made the road harder to see. My headlights caught only the nearest stretch of cracked pavement before everything beyond dissolved into black. I leaned forward over the steering wheel without realizing it, scanning for anything familiar. After another 20 minutes, I came to an intersection where the pavement ended in both directions, except the one I had come from. I slowed to a crawl. The dirt road to the left disappeared into a tunnel of overhanging branches. The one to the right sloped downward steeply. I didn't like the idea of driving deeper into unknown territory, but I also didn't want to turn back without knowing if I'd missed a sign. I chose the left turn, hoping it would eventually reconnect to something. The dirt road was rough, with deep ruts that shook the car hard enough to rattle the mirrors. Fallen leaves covered most of it, so I could only guess where the tire tracks had once been. It felt abandoned, but not in a clean and used way. More like it had been slowly swallowed by the woods over the years. I tried not to think about how far I was from anyone else. My headlights lit up nothing but more trees, their trunks close enough together that I couldn't see more than a few feet into them. Then I noticed something. Every so often, I'd pass what looked like small piles of rocks near the edge of the road. They weren't natural. The shapes were too neat, each stack about the same height. The first one I dismissed, but after the third or fourth, it started to bother me. They were always just at the point where my headlights reached their farthest. I couldn't tell if they'd been there for years, or if they were more recent. The road eventually widened into a small clearing. I pulled into it, intending to turn around. The ground here was uneven, with patches of exposed roots and a thin layer of mist hanging low. That's when I saw movement, not clear, just a shift in the darkness between two trees. My hands tightened on the wheel. It could have been an animal. The woods were full of them. But the way it moved didn't feel like an animal running. It was slower, more deliberate, almost like it was matching my car's movement. I stayed still, engine idling. My headlights washed over the tree trunks ahead, and for a moment, I thought I caught a glimpse of something pale, but it was gone before I could focus. I told myself it was probably just bark or a patch of lichen catching the light. Still, the air felt different now, heavier, colder. I decided to leave. I shifted into reverse, keeping my eyes on the space where I'd seen the movement. As I backed up, the car jolted over a root, and for a split second, my headlights angled upward into the trees. That's when I saw it again. Something there, taller than I expected, partially hidden behind a trunk. I didn't stop to think about it. I straightened the wheel and pressed harder on the gas, bumping back down the dirt road. The drive out felt longer than the way in. Every turn looked the same, and I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see something behind me. I didn't, but the sense of being watched stayed. My gas gauge was even lower now, the needle close to empty. I pushed the car faster than I should have over the uneven ground, desperate to get back to the main road. Finally, I saw the intersection again and turned back the way I'd come. The relief didn't last. A few minutes later, I noticed the first rock pile again, this time on the opposite side of the road. Then another. They were spaced exactly the same as before. I hadn't seen them on my way in, but now they felt like markers. The road felt narrower than before, my headlights barely keeping up as I took each curve. My eyes kept darting to the trees, searching for more movement, and I thought I saw it a couple more times, quick, shadow-like motions that disappeared before I could focus. My hands were starting to ache from gripping the wheel so tightly. Eventually, the trees began to thin, and I saw the faint glow of what might have been a streetlight far ahead. My chest eased a little. I reached the light, which turned out to be hanging over a small gas station, the first building I'd seen in hours. It was old, with only one pump, but it looked like salvation. I pulled in fast, but when I stepped out of the car, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. There were no insects buzzing, no wind in the trees, nothing. Just a heavy, still silence. The pump was outdated, the kind where you had to flip a metal lever before the gas would flow. As I started fueling up, I caught myself glancing toward the tree line across the road. It was pitch black beyond the edge of the light, and the longer I looked, the more certain I became that something was there, just far enough back to be hidden. I finished fueling quickly, got back in the car, and drove toward the nearest sign for a highway. Even after I reached the motel later that night, the feeling didn't leave. I kept thinking about that pale shape between the trees, the rock piles, and how the movement always seemed to stay just at the edge of my vision. When I checked my car the next morning, I noticed something I couldn't explain. Along the bottom of the passenger side door, just above the dirt splash from the road, there were streaks, long, thin marks that cut through the grime, as if something had brushed against it on the drive. They were too high to be from branches. I wiped them away, but even as they faded, I couldn't shake the thought that they hadn't been there before I took that turn into the woods. I didn't tell anyone about it. I just left, making sure I stayed on the main roads the rest of the way. But even now, when I think about that night, I can still see the stacks of rocks in my headlights and feel the weight of those woods pressing in from all sides. I know I made it out, but I don't think I was ever completely alone on that road. It was supposed to be just another quiet evening, one of those days where nothing much happens and you're almost bored of how calm things are. I'd had a long week, and all I wanted was some air away from the noise of town. I decided to take a drive out past the edge of the city, into an area I knew well, quiet fields, some patches of woods, and a stretch of old service roads that hardly anyone used anymore. I'd been there plenty of times, even at night, and never had a reason to feel uneasy. It wasn't like it was a dangerous area. But that night, something about the air felt different even before I got there, though I didn't realize it until much later. I remember parking my car on the side of the narrow road where the asphalt ended and gravel took over. The sun had already set, and the last light was fading fast. It wasn't pitch black yet, but the sky was deep blue, and the shadows from the trees made it hard to see too far ahead. The place was quiet, so quiet that my ears felt like they were straining to catch something. The wind barely moved, and the air had that stillness that makes every small sound feel sharp. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment, not because I really thought I needed it yet, but because I knew it would be dark in minutes. There was a trail I liked to walk along there. It started from a break in the tree line just off the road, a narrow dirt path that cut between thick brush before winding deeper into the woods. I'd walked it enough times to know where it led, a small clearing about half a mile in. From there, you could see the sky pretty well because the trees opened up above you. I figured I'd go there, maybe sit for a while, then head back before it got too late. The first part of the walk was fine. The dirt under my boots was still dry from days without rain, and my flashlight stayed off for the first few minutes since the fading light was enough. But as I went further, the trees grew thicker, and the dim light was swallowed up. I clicked on my flashlight, and its beam cut through the darkness ahead of me. That's when I noticed how quiet it really was. Normally, you'd hear crickets or the rustle of leaves from small animals moving in the undergrowth. But that night, there was nothing, just the crunch of my own steps and the occasional creak of branches swaying slightly overhead. I kept walking, but I started to get that feeling you get when you think someone might be behind you. It wasn't strong at first, just a faint itch in the back of my mind. I told myself it was because it was dark and my brain was just filling in things. Still, without meaning to, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than usual. Each time, the beam of my flashlight would sweep over the trees and undergrowth, catching on twisted branches or clusters of leaves, but there was never anything there. By the time I reached the clearing, the sky above was black, sprinkled with a few faint stars. I stood there for a minute, breathing in the cool air. The ground was covered with short, dry grass, and the open space made me feel a little better after the cramped feeling of the trail. I walked to the middle and slowly turned in a circle, letting the light from my flashlight pass over the tree line around me. That's when I saw something, a shape, just at the edge where the trees met the clearing. At first, I thought it was just a tree trunk, but something about it seemed wrong. It was slightly hunched, like it wasn't completely vertical, and I thought I caught the faint outline of shoulders. My flashlight lingered on it for a moment, and as soon as the light touched it, the shape moved, slipping back into the shadows of the trees with a smoothness that made my stomach tighten. I froze. My heart started to pound hard, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. It could have been an animal, I told myself. Maybe a deer startled by the light. But even as I thought it, something about the movement didn't feel right. A deer would have bolted, made noise. This shape moved too quietly, like it was trying not to be heard. I turned slowly, scanning the edges of the clearing again, but nothing stood out. Still, I could feel that same itch on the back of my neck. Worse now. I didn't want to seem like I was running from nothing, so I walked back toward the trail at a steady pace, trying to keep my steps quiet. As soon as I was back under the cover of the trees, I noticed how dark it had gotten. My flashlight beam looked small compared to the thick blackness around me. Every step I took seemed louder than it should have been. After a few minutes, I heard it, something behind me. It was faint at first, just the crunch of leaves, but it matched my steps too closely. I'd take a step, and half a second later, I'd hear another one. I stopped walking. The sound stopped too. I stood there for what felt like forever, my flashlight fixed on the trail ahead, my ears straining. The air felt heavier now, like it was pressing in on me. I thought about calling out, but the idea of breaking the silence seemed worse than keeping it. Slowly, I started walking again, this time moving a little faster. The sound came back, crunch, crunch, never too close, but always there. The further I went, the more the trees seemed to press in from both sides. My flashlight flickered once, making my chest tighten, but it stayed on. I tried to keep my breathing even, but I could feel it getting faster. Then I heard something different, just off the trail to my left, maybe 10 feet away. It was a short, sharp sound, like someone stepping on a branch. I turned my flashlight toward it, but the beam only lit up thick underbrush. No movement. I didn't want to run, but my legs were starting to twitch with the urge. I kept my pace steady, but every part of me was focused on the sounds around me. That's when I heard breathing. Not my own. I could hear mine clearly, but this was slower, heavier, coming from behind me. It was faint, but it was there, steady and deliberate. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just walked faster, my boots crunching on the dirt and leaves, the sound behind me keeping pace. My heart was hammering so hard it almost drowned everything else out. I knew I was maybe a couple hundred yards from the road, but it felt like miles. Then, from somewhere behind me and to the right, I heard movement, faster this time, pushing through the brush. My body acted before my mind did, and I broke into a run. The beam of my flashlight shook wildly as I sprinted down the trail, the sound of something moving behind me getting louder. I didn't look back. My focus was on the small patch of gravel ahead where the trail opened onto the road. When I burst out of the trees, the sudden openness made me stumble, but I kept running until I reached my car. I yanked the door open, jumped in, and locked it without even looking around. My breathing was ragged, my hands shaking as I shoved the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I pulled away fast, my headlights cutting through the darkness of the empty road. I didn't see anything in my mirrors, but I kept checking them all the way back into town. Even after I was surrounded by streetlights and houses again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me as far as it could, stopping only when it knew I was gone. When I finally parked in my driveway, I sat there in the car for a while, letting the silence settle around me. My clothes were damp with sweat, and my pulse was still racing. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I'd imagined the breathing and the footsteps. But deep down, I knew better. Something had been there, in those woods, and it had followed me almost all the way out. I never went back to that trail again. Even now, years later, I can still remember that sound, the slow, steady breathing in the dark, and the way it matched my steps like it was waiting for me to slip, to stop, to turn around. And I still wonder what would have happened if I had. I woke up earlier than usual that day, the kind of morning where the air feels different before anything has even happened. My plan was simple: take the old dirt road behind my uncle's place and follow it deep into the hills, just to see how far it went. I'd walked that road plenty of times before, but never more than a few miles. This time, I packed enough to last the entire day. Water, a couple of sandwiches, a flashlight even though I didn't plan to stay past sunset, and a small folding knife that I usually carried when hiking. I didn't tell anyone I was going. My uncle had gone into town early, and I figured I'd be back before anyone even noticed I was gone. The dirt road started out wide and familiar, with dry grass spilling over from the edges and little rocks scattered in the tire ruts. There were no houses this far out, just stretches of scrubby land with patches of pine and oak. The sun was still low enough that the air had that cool, damp feel, and every sound seemed sharper. I could hear the crunch of gravel under my shoes and the occasional rustle in the brush from small animals I never saw. The first couple of miles went by quickly, the road climbing and bending between low hills. After an hour, I reached a fork. To the right, the road continued as I remembered, eventually leading toward the old cattle range. To the left, a narrower track I'd never taken before disappeared between two steep, tree-covered slopes. Something about that left path caught my attention. The dirt was darker there, as if shaded most of the day, and the air felt still, like the trees were blocking not just the wind, but some of the outside world. I stood there for a while, debating whether to stick to the route I knew, but curiosity won out. I stepped onto the left trail, and immediately felt the temperature drop. The trees here grew closer together, their branches meeting above in tangled arches that blocked much of the sunlight. The ground was littered with fallen needles and damp leaves, muffling my footsteps. I noticed the smell too, earthy, almost heavy, like wet soil after a storm. The deeper I went, the less I heard. The breeze that had followed me along the main road was gone. Even the birds seemed scarce. About a mile in, the path narrowed further, forcing me to step over roots and duck under low limbs. It didn't feel like a road anymore, more like a trail no one had used in years. I started wondering if maybe it was a logging path, abandoned after the work was done. A fallen tree blocked part of the way, its bark stripped and pale. I climbed over it, careful not to slip on the slick moss covering the trunk. It was somewhere after that tree that I noticed something strange. Faint impressions in the ground, spaced out in a way that didn't look like deer tracks. They were too long, too narrow. The kind of shape a heavy boot might make in soft dirt. I crouched down to look closer. They weren't fresh, but they hadn't been there long either. Maybe a day or two at most. It struck me as odd because this was a dead-end area as far as I knew. Nobody had reason to walk out here. I kept moving, telling myself it wasn't unusual. People explored all kinds of places for no reason. Still, I found myself glancing over my shoulder every so often. The light kept shifting as the sun climbed higher, but here in the shade it stayed dim, and I started to lose track of time. My phone had no signal, which I'd expected, but the little clock on the screen told me it was already late morning. I stopped to drink some water and eat half of a sandwich before pressing on. The trail dipped suddenly, leading down into a small ravine where a narrow creek ran. The water was clear but sluggish, and the rocks along the banks were slick with algae. I followed the trail as it crossed a crude wooden plank bridge, just two logs laid side by side. On the other side, the ground began to rise again, and the trees seemed older here, thicker trunks, deep bark grooves, roots twisting above the soil like ropes. That's when I heard it. Not loud, but enough to make me stop. A single, deliberate crack of wood somewhere behind me. It wasn't a branch falling from a tree. It had that sharp, quick sound like someone stepping on a dry stick. I stood perfectly still, holding my breath, ears straining. The silence that followed was heavier than before. I turned slowly, scanning the trail behind me, but saw nothing but trees and the shadowed path winding back toward the bridge. I told myself it could have been an animal. Out here, even a squirrel can make a noise that seems too big for its size. But I didn't move right away. I stayed there for a good minute, listening. When nothing else happened, I forced myself to keep walking, though I found myself speeding up without meaning to. The trail began to climb more steeply, and my breathing grew heavier. Every so often, I thought I heard faint movement somewhere in the trees, small shifts of leaves, or the muffled thump of something soft hitting the ground. Each time I stopped, it stopped too. That started to gnaw at me. Animals don't usually match your pace like that. I gripped the knife in my pocket without taking it out, feeling the cold metal against my palm. Eventually, the trail opened into a small clearing. The grass here was patchy, and in the center was what looked like the remains of an old hunting blind. Just a crude platform nailed between two trees, weathered and falling apart. I could see empty cans and rusted bits of metal scattered near the base, half buried in dirt. I took the chance to rest for a moment, keeping my back to one of the trees so nothing could come up behind me. That's when I caught movement to my left. Not big, not obvious, just a shape slipping between two trees about 30 yards away. It was gone as soon as I saw it, but my heart kicked hard in my chest. Whatever it was upright. That much I was sure of. I waited, straining my eyes at the spot where it had been. Nothing. I decided right then that I'd gone far enough. I didn't want to turn this into something I couldn't get out of. I started back down the trail, moving quickly, but trying not to make it obvious that I was hurrying. My ears felt tuned to every sound now, and the forest seemed alive in a way it hadn't before. Not with birds or insects, but with small, almost imperceptible movements. Halfway back to the bridge, I heard that crack again. Closer this time. I didn't stop to look. My pace quickened into something between a fast walk and a jog. I could feel the sweat under my shirt despite the cool air. When I reached the bridge, I crossed it in 2 long steps, the logs creaking under my weight. On the other side, I paused just long enough to glance back. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees where the bridge ended, but the light was playing tricks through the branches, and I wasn't sure. From there, I didn't stop. The trail seemed longer going back, each bend revealing only more distance. The urge to run was strong, but I forced myself to keep it to a brisk walk, not wanting to trip over roots or rocks in my haste. My mouth felt dry despite the water I'd had earlier, and my legs ached from the steady climb. When I finally reached the fork where the left trail met the main road, the light was glaring and hot, the air moving again. I didn't look back this time. I kept walking until the trees thinned, and I could see the outline of my uncle's property in the distance. Only when I stepped onto the gravel of his driveway did I let out the breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. That night, I kept thinking about those footprints, and the shape I'd glimpsed in the clearing. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just another hiker who'd taken a different route, someone I never properly saw. But the way the sounds followed me, the way I never caught a clear look, it sat wrong in my mind. I decided I wouldn't go down that left trail again, not alone, not without telling anyone. Even now, when I pass that fork, I feel that same drop in temperature, that same stillness hanging in the air. And I keep walking straight, without even glancing left. Whatever's down there, it can stay there. I don't need to find out. I had been looking forward to that weekend for months. The plan was simple. Drive out to a quiet place far away from the city, camp for a couple of nights, and just enjoy the open air without the constant noise of traffic or my phone buzzing every few minutes. I packed my old tent, a sleeping bag, enough food to last 2 days, and a small gas stove for cooking. I decided not to bring too much because I wanted to travel light, but I did make sure to bring extra water and a flashlight with spare batteries. The place I chose was an area I had read about online, a patch of open land next to a line of woods with a small stream running through it. It wasn't an official campsite, which meant fewer people, but also no amenities or park rangers. That was part of the appeal for me, being completely on my own. The drive there took about 4 hours. The roads became narrower the farther I went, and by the time I reached the turnoff, the asphalt had given way to a rough gravel road with patches of dirt. My car bounced over potholes and rocks, and I had to slow down to avoid hitting the underside. On either side, tall grass swayed in the wind, and beyond that were rolling hills and scattered groves of trees. The last mile was a single-lane track barely wide enough for my car, and when it finally opened into a wide clearing, I stopped and got out. The air felt different, cleaner, cooler, with that faint earthy smell of grass and damp soil. The only sounds were the wind and the faint rush of water somewhere nearby. I parked at the edge of the clearing and walked around to get a sense of the place. The open field stretched about 200 feet before meeting the start of the forest. The tree line was thick, a mix of tall pines and broadleaf trees whose branches created a wall of green and shadow. A small ridge ran along one side, just high enough to hide whatever lay beyond it. The stream I'd heard was only a few steps inside the woods, a narrow ribbon of clear water running over smooth stones. I decided this would be the perfect spot to set up camp. Close enough to water, but far enough from the forest to see anything approaching. Setting up the tent took less than half an hour. I staked it down facing the forest, thinking it would be nice to wake up to that view. Once everything was ready, I built a small fire pit using rocks I found nearby, set up my folding chair, and boiled water for coffee. The late afternoon sun was warm, and I spent some time just sitting there, drinking and watching the light shift across the field. Around me, insects buzzed lazily, and every now and then I'd hear a bird calling from deep in the woods. By the time the sun began to dip behind the ridge, the temperature had started to drop. The shadows from the trees stretched longer across the grass, and the sky took on that soft golden glow that fades into evening. I cooked a simple meal of noodles and vegetables, cleaned up, and added more wood to the fire. It was peaceful, so quiet that every small sound carried far. I could hear the occasional rustle from the forest, probably small animals moving through the undergrowth, and the steady flow of the stream. It was just after the sun had fully set, when the sky turned a deep blue and stars began to appear, that I noticed something strange. On the ridge about 200 feet away, a dark shape moved steadily from one side to the other. The figure was too far to make out clearly, but it was upright, walking at a slow, even pace. At first, I thought it might be another camper or a hiker heading back, but there was no trail up there that I knew of. The ridge was uneven and overgrown. Climbing it would have been awkward. The figure didn't stop, didn't turn toward me, just kept moving until it disappeared over the far edge. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe someone local was cutting across the land, or maybe it was a hunter, but a part of me felt unsettled. The movement had been so deliberate, so calm, almost as if the person knew exactly where they were going. I kept glancing at the ridge for a while, but nothing else appeared. Eventually, I went back to tending the fire and tried to focus on the sound of the stream and the stars overhead. Later that night, I decided I needed more firewood. The stack I had wouldn't last until morning if the temperature kept dropping. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the forest. The beam of light cut through the darkness, catching glimpses of trunks, branches, and patches of brush. Inside the woods, the air felt different, cooler, damper, and heavier. The smell of wet leaves was strong, and the ground was soft underfoot with layers of fallen needles and moss. I moved slowly, scanning for fallen branches and dry wood. The flashlight beam swung side to side, sometimes catching the glint of eyes low to the ground, probably rabbits or raccoons. I had been walking for maybe 5 minutes when I heard it, a slow, heavy breathing somewhere behind me. At first, I thought it was just my own breath echoing in my ears, so I held it for a moment. The sound continued, rhythmic and steady. I turned slowly, sweeping the flashlight through the trees. There was nothing solid that I could make out, but I caught faint movement, something shifting between the trunks, too far for the beam to fully catch. The breathing seemed to grow fainter, as if it was moving away, but it still echoed in the quiet. My heart began to pound, and I felt that crawling sensation at the back of my neck that told me I was being watched. I didn't waste time after that. I picked up the wood I'd gathered and made my way back toward the tent as quickly as I could without running. The beam of my flashlight jumped with each step, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following. By the time I stepped out of the woods and into the clearing, the fire was still glowing, and the sight of it felt like a relief. I added the wood to the fire and sat close to it, staring into the flames. The night around me seemed darker now, heavier, as if the forest itself had shifted somehow. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made my muscles tense. I stayed up much later than planned, feeding the fire, listening, and watching the ridge and the forest edge. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I crawled into the tent, keeping the flashlight within reach. Sleep was restless. I woke several times, certain I'd heard faint footsteps or the distant crunch of grass. Each time, I'd hold my breath and listen, but the sound would fade, leaving only the quiet hum of insects and the distant stream. When morning finally came, the light felt harsh and too bright after such a long night. The ridge was empty, and the forest looked still and ordinary. I made breakfast quickly, all the while feeling like I needed to leave. There was no clear reason. Nothing had actually happened to me, but the unease from the night before hadn't faded. I packed slowly, checking the tree line every few minutes. By the time my car was loaded, the air had warmed, and the field looked peaceful again. Still, as I drove away, I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see that dark figure standing on the ridge, watching me go. Even after I got home, the feeling stayed with me. I tried to reason it out. Maybe the figure was just a local farmer. Maybe the breathing I heard was from a deer or some other large animal. But something about it didn't fit. The steady pace of the figure, the way the breathing had seemed to follow me before drifting away, the absolute quiet of the night, it all felt too intentional. I told myself I wouldn't go back there alone again. Some places just carry a weight you can't shake, and no amount of reasoning changes that. It started as just another normal day, though I realize now how quickly a normal day can turn into something I'll remember for the rest of my life. The sun had been bright that morning, the kind of light that makes everything look clean and open. I had taken my car out for a long drive, partly because I needed some quiet, and partly because I wanted to explore some back roads I'd never been down before. I had no plan, no set route, just following whatever turn felt interesting. The air was warm but not too hot, and my windows were down. The further I went, the fewer houses I saw. At first there were still some small homes here and there, with mailboxes leaning toward the road and front yards littered with rusted tools or kids' bikes. Then those became rare, and the road started narrowing, twisting more, with dense trees crowding closer to the sides. I didn't mind at first. I've always liked being in quiet, rural places. But I noticed how quickly it went from open fields to this wall of green on both sides, almost no shoulder to the road, and not a single other car passing by. After another 20 minutes, I realized I hadn't seen a house in a while. No driveways either, just dirt paths that disappeared into the woods. I was still on a paved road, but it was cracked and patched so many times that it was rough and uneven. Every now and then, a large branch lay partly in the road, and I had to swerve to avoid it. I told myself I'd turn around soon, but the road kept curving, and I kept thinking maybe just around the next bend I'd see something interesting. When I finally decided to turn back, I realized there wasn't a good spot to do it. The road was too narrow, and the ditches on either side were deep enough that trying to pull in and reverse could easily get me stuck. I figured I'd just keep going until I found a wider area. But the road didn't widen. In fact, it started to feel like it was closing in even more. The trees were so thick now that their branches hung over the road like a canopy, blocking out most of the sun. The light had shifted to that dim greenish shade you get in the woods, and I had to turn on my headlights even though it wasn't evening yet. I checked my phone, no signal. That was the first moment I felt that little knot of unease in my stomach. Still, I told myself it was fine. I'd been in plenty of places without service before. I just needed to keep driving until I found an intersection or a wider space to turn around. It must have been another 10 minutes before I saw something that made me slow down. Up ahead, the road bent sharply, but right before the bend, there was a dirt turnout on the right. It wasn't much wider than my car, but it looked like it led to an old logging path, or maybe a hunting trail. I slowed and was about to pull into it when I noticed something strange in the dirt. Tire tracks. Fresh ones. The dirt wasn't dusty. It was soft, like it had rained here recently, and the tread marks were deep crisp. Whatever vehicle made them had come through not long ago. That in itself wasn't alarming, but next to the tire tracks were footprints. Not boot prints like you might expect out here, but what looked like bare feet. Large ones. The toes were clearly visible, pressed deep into the soft earth. They led off the turnout and into the trees. I sat there with my foot on the brake, staring at those prints. They didn't look like someone just walking casually. They were spaced unevenly, some deeper than others, like whoever it was had been moving quickly. I couldn't explain why, but it gave me an odd, unsettled feeling. I decided not to stop after all and kept driving. But I found myself checking the mirrors more often than usual, half expecting to see someone coming up the road behind me, even though I hadn't seen a single other car in nearly an hour. The road eventually began to slope downward, winding tightly between steep banks. The trees on the banks leaned in so much I couldn't see the sky anymore, just patches of dull light filtering through leaves. That feeling of isolation was stronger now. The silence inside the car was so complete that I could hear the faint ticking of the cooling engine when I stopped at one point. I was coming out of another sharp bend when I saw movement ahead. My foot hovered over the brake before I even registered what it was, a figure crossing the road. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothing that didn't match the warm weather. He wasn't hurrying. He just walked straight across from one side to the other, disappearing into the trees on the far side. He never looked at me, but something about his posture felt wrong. Too rigid, almost deliberate, like he wanted to make it clear he wasn't concerned about a car coming. I slowed nearly to a stop when I reached the spot he'd crossed. There was no path on either side, just dense undergrowth. I couldn't see where he'd gone, but the bushes swayed slightly, as if he'd just pushed through them. That knot in my stomach was tighter now. My instincts were telling me to leave. I pressed the gas and kept going, glancing in the mirror more often, scanning the tree-line as I drove. The road seemed to go on forever with no sign of change, and I was beginning to worry about running low on fuel if I didn't find my way back soon. It must have been another 15 minutes before I saw something ahead, an old bridge. The road narrowed even more as it reached it, the guardrails on each side dented and rusted. Beneath it was a shallow creek, the water barely moving. The bridge looked unstable, the boards warped in places, but it was my only option unless I wanted to backtrack miles. As I drove onto it, I noticed something on the far side, a dark shape off to the right. I thought it might be a tree stump at first, but as I got closer, I realized it was a vehicle, a pickup truck. It was parked at an odd angle, half in the ditch, its driver's door hanging open. I slowed, heart thumping. There was no one inside. The paint was scratched deeply along one side, like it had scraped against something solid. The windshield had a crack running across it, and the front bumper was bent inward. I passed it slowly, glancing into the trees beyond it. The undergrowth was trampled in places, and I thought I saw more of those deep, bare footprints in the soft earth. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I didn't want to be here anymore. From that point on, I drove faster, taking the curves harder than I normally would. My eyes kept darting between the road ahead and the mirrors, expecting movement. It was maybe 10 more minutes before I finally saw a sign, just a small, bent metal one with faded letters. It pointed toward a highway I recognized. Relief washed through me, but it was mixed with something else, a heavy, crawling unease that didn't leave even as I reached familiar roads. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the man I'd seen crossing the road, the fresh tire tracks and bare footprints, the abandoned truck. None of it made sense in a way that felt safe. I still don't know what was going on out there, but I know I wasn't meant to see it. And I know for certain that I'll never take that road again. If I had stayed in that turnout, if I had gotten out of my car, or even just hesitated longer at the bridge, I don't think I'd be here telling this story. It was late in the afternoon when I decided to take the back road home. I had been working in town all day, and instead of following the main highway like everyone else, I thought I'd try the narrow country route. It was longer in distance but quieter, with rolling fields on either side and long stretches of forest. The air felt cooler out here, away from the noise and fumes of the city. The sun was sinking low, casting a dim orange glow across the tops of the trees. I figured I'd be home before dark, but I didn't realize just how quickly that light would vanish once the road dipped between the thick woods. The road was barely wide enough for 2 cars, cracked and worn from years of weather. Every so often, I'd hit a patch where the asphalt had crumbled away, leaving exposed gravel. On both sides, thick forest pressed in close, with towering trees that blocked most of the light. It wasn't the kind of place you wanted to break down, but my car was in good shape, and I had fuel. I didn't think twice about it. I rolled down the window, letting the cool evening air drift in. It smelled damp, like wet leaves and soil. I could hear the occasional bird call deep in the forest, but otherwise it was quiet, too quiet. No other cars passed me, and I didn't see any houses. I glanced at my phone once, only to notice I had no signal. Not surprising out here, but it still made me uneasy. About 20 minutes in, I came around a bend and saw something on the side of the road ahead. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer, but as I got closer, I realized it was a bicycle, lying half in the ditch with its back wheel still spinning slowly. There was no rider in sight. I slowed down, scanning the trees on either side. The forest here was so dense that you couldn't see more than a few feet in before shadows swallowed everything. The bike looked like it had been dropped suddenly, not laid down carefully. The handlebars were crooked, and the chain hung loose, like it had slipped off mid-ride. I drove past slowly, checking my mirrors, but I didn't see anyone. I considered stopping, but something in my gut told me to keep going. Out here, alone, with no reception, I didn't like the idea of wandering into the trees looking for someone I didn't know. The road wound deeper into the woods, and the air grew cooler. The sun had dropped behind the hills now, and the orange light had faded into a dull gray. My headlights cut a narrow path ahead, but the darkness beyond them felt heavier than normal, like the forest was absorbing the light. I noticed my own breathing, slow but tense, as if my body was aware of something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. A few miles later, I rounded another bend and caught sight of movement in the ditch ahead. It was quick, just a shadow at the edge of my headlights, but I was sure it was a person. I slowed again, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. As the car crept forward, I saw someone crouched low in the grass, facing away from the road. They weren't moving, just sitting there, almost hidden. I couldn't see their face, but they were wearing dark clothes, and their posture looked tense, like they were waiting. I passed them slowly, resisting the urge to look directly. My skin prickled as I realized they hadn't turned their head at all to watch me pass. I checked my rearview mirror. Nothing. The person was gone. The ditch was empty. My first thought was that they had dropped flat to the ground to hide. I felt my chest tighten, and I pressed the accelerator a little harder. The next stretch of road was dead straight for nearly half a mile, lined with trees that leaned in overhead. The darkness felt thicker here, the beam of my headlights barely reaching far enough to make me comfortable. I kept glancing in my mirrors, half expecting to see someone following on foot. My pulse was quick now, my body leaning forward slightly, as if it would help me see more. I had just started to calm down when something hit the back of my car. It wasn't loud, more like a dull thud, but I felt it through the seat. I slammed the brakes, the tires skidding slightly on the worn pavement. My headlights lit the empty road ahead. I sat there for a second, frozen, my breath shallow. Then I put the car in reverse and backed up a few feet, thinking maybe I'd hit a fallen branch or some debris. The road behind me was clear. No branch, no animal, nothing. That was when I saw the handprint. It was on the dust of my rear window, fresh, smudged, and large. Fingers spread wide, pressed flat against the glass. My stomach dropped, and I slammed the car into drive, flooring the gas pedal. The engine roared, and the trees whipped past in the beam of my headlights. I didn't look back again. The road seemed endless now, every bend looking the same. I couldn't tell if I was making progress or just looping deeper into the forest. My knuckles were white around the steering wheel, and I had to force myself to breathe evenly. The rational part of my mind tried to come up with explanations. Maybe someone was hitchhiking and thought I'd stopped. Maybe it was just a prank, but nothing felt right. The handprint was too deliberate, too sudden. After what felt like half an hour, I saw the faint glow of a streetlight ahead. Relief hit me so hard I almost laughed. The road opened up into a small intersection with an old, shuttered gas station on one corner. The windows were boarded, the sign faded, but the light above the lot still worked, buzzing faintly. I pulled in and parked under it, letting the brightness wash over me. I got out, walking quickly to the back of the car. The handprint was still there, clear as before, but now I noticed something else. Thin streaks running down from the palm, like someone's fingers had been wet. The streaks had dried into the dust, leaving faint, uneven trails. I reached up without thinking and touched them. They were sticky. I wiped my hand on my jeans and got back in the car, locking the doors. I sat there for a long minute, trying to steady my breathing. I wanted to keep going, but the thought of re-entering that dark stretch of forest made my stomach twist. Eventually, I pulled out, following the side road instead of the main one, even though it would take me longer. The rest of the drive was quiet, but I kept checking the mirrors, half convinced I'd see someone crouched in the back seat. When I finally reached my driveway, I left the car parked outside and went straight in, locking the door behind me. I didn't go back out until morning. In daylight, the handprint was gone, as if the dew had washed it away. But I couldn't stop thinking about how far into the forest I had been, with no signal, no traffic, and someone close enough to touch my car without me seeing them. That bike in the ditch, the figure crouched in the grass, the quiet, patient way they seemed to wait. I still take the long way home sometimes, but never through those woods. And when I drive at night, I keep my eyes forward and my doors locked, because I know how easy it is for someone to step out of the dark and put their hand on the glass. I woke up earlier than usual that morning, even though I hadn't planned to. The air in the room felt heavy, not in a way that suggested anything strange, just in that dense, almost damp way that mornings can feel after a long night of rain. I could hear the quiet dripping of water from somewhere outside, probably from the trees that bordered the property. I rolled over, staring at the wall for a while, not feeling ready to start the day, but also too restless to just stay in bed. When I finally stood up, my legs felt stiff from the previous day's work. I'd been helping a friend move a stack of old firewood from behind the shed to a new storage rack we built near the driveway. The yard around the house was surrounded by thick woods. It wasn't the kind of place where you could see your neighbors. In fact, you couldn't even hear them most of the time. There was just the steady sound of wind through the trees, birds, and sometimes, if you listened closely, the rustle of something moving in the undergrowth. By the time I'd made some coffee and eaten breakfast, the rain had mostly stopped. The clouds were still low, hanging in heavy clumps over the tops of the trees, but every now and then, a brighter patch of sky would break through. I decided to go outside and walk the property line, just to make sure everything was fine after the storm. I pulled on my boots, zipped up a light jacket, and stepped outside. The air smelled earthy and damp, like wet leaves and soil. The grass was slick under my boots, and small streams of water were still running down the slope toward the ditch by the road. As I made my way toward the back of the property, I noticed that the ground was softer than usual, my feet sinking slightly into the mud. There's a narrow trail that leads from the back of the yard into the woods. It isn't an official trail, just a worn path I've made over the years from walking it so many times. I followed it, moving slowly, not because I was tired, but because I liked taking in the small details. The way the water clung to the pine needles, the sound of distant crows, the faint snapping of wet twigs under my boots. About 15 minutes into the walk, I noticed something odd. Just off to the left, maybe 20 feet away, the ground looked disturbed. The leaves and pine needles had been scraped aside, and the soil underneath was darker, freshly exposed. It wasn't in the usual spots where deer dig, or where fallen branches had shifted the ground. This was a clean, oval-shaped patch of disturbed earth, about the size of a small sleeping bag. I stopped for a while, just looking at it. My first thought was that maybe a tree had fallen and been cleared away, but there was no sign of that. No broken branches, no fresh stumps. The longer I stared at it, the more uneasy I felt, though I couldn't figure out exactly why. It wasn't until I noticed faint depressions leading away from the disturbed patch that my stomach tightened. They weren't the sharp outlines of footprints, but they looked like something heavy had been dragged. The marks wound their way deeper into the woods. I followed them slowly. The ground was wet enough that each indentation held a small pool of water. The marks curved in an irregular pattern, as though whatever had made them had been shifted or pulled in stops and starts. I kept going for maybe another 100 yards, my boots sinking deeper into the mud as the trees closed in around me. The canopy here was thicker, blocking out much of the dim daylight. That's when I saw it. Hanging from the lower branch of a tree ahead of me was a piece of rope. It wasn't swinging in the wind, just hanging still, the end frayed. Below it, the ground was heavily scuffed up. There was no sign of anything else, just that rope and the disturbed earth beneath it. I stood there, looking up at the branch, then back down at the ground, feeling a slow, creeping discomfort work its way into my chest. I didn't touch anything. I just kept scanning the area, listening. The woods had gone strangely quiet. No bird calls, no wind, just the occasional drip of water falling from leaves. My ears strained for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. I turned and made my way back the way I had come, moving faster now. The disturbed patch of earth I'd seen earlier came back into view, and as I passed it, I realized something I hadn't noticed before. Around the edges of the patch, the soil was pressed down in a pattern that looked like the knees and hands of someone who had been crouched there. Back in the yard, the air felt different. Open, less pressing. I walked straight to the shed, found the lock, and made sure it was secure. Then I went inside and closed the door behind me, the sound of the latch sliding into place giving me a small sense of comfort. But the unease didn't leave me. I kept thinking about the shape of that disturbed ground, the dragging marks, and the rope hanging from the tree. I didn't know what had happened out there, and I didn't want to guess, but I knew it wasn't something I should ignore. Later that afternoon, I drove into town. I didn't tell anyone exactly what I'd found. I just stopped by the sheriff's office and said that they might want to take a look at something on my property. The deputy didn't ask many questions, just nodded and said they'd send someone out the next day. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the rope swaying slightly in the still air of the woods, even though I knew it hadn't moved when I'd been standing there. I kept thinking about how fresh the disturbed earth had looked, how the dragging marks were still so clear in the wet ground. Whoever, or whatever, had made them hadn't been there long before I arrived. The next morning, I waited for the deputies. They showed up around 9, their boots leaving clean prints in the wet grass as they crossed the yard. I stayed by the edge of the woods while they went in. From where I stood, I could just see the flashes of their jackets between the trees as they moved deeper along the trail. It took them almost an hour to come back. One of them was carrying a small evidence bag with something inside I couldn't see from where I was. They didn't say much, just thanked me for calling it in. The way they looked at each other before they left told me they'd found something important. I never asked what it was. I didn't want to know. But from that day forward, I stopped walking that trail alone. I kept to the open parts of the yard, where I could see the house and the road. The woods that had always felt quiet and peaceful now seemed different, like there was something just out of sight, watching, waiting. And even though I never went back to that rope, I sometimes imagine it's still there, fraying a little more with each passing season. The ground beneath it holding a story I don't want to understand. It was late afternoon when I decided to go for a walk. The day had been warm, but the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows across the uneven ground. I had been restless all day, sitting inside, scrolling through my phone, and watching the light slowly fade from the windows. I thought a walk would clear my head. I didn't have a destination in mind, just the vague idea of heading down the old dirt road at the edge of town. It was a road I had walked before, but not often. It stretched out in a winding path past some empty fields, and then disappeared into a patch of thick woods. The air had a stillness to it that I didn't notice at first. The wind had stopped, and the faint hum of cars from the highway seemed farther away than usual. My shoes crunched against the gravel, the sound loud in the quiet. The further I went, the less I could hear anything except the sound of my own footsteps and my breathing. The smell of dry grass mixed with the faint scent of damp soil as the road began to slope slightly downward toward the tree line. The woods ahead looked darker than they should have for this time of day. The sun was still above the horizon, but the thick canopy of branches already turned the path into a tunnel of shadows. The dirt was packed tight here, with scattered leaves and twigs underfoot. I stepped into the shade and instantly felt the temperature drop. My skin prickled from the sudden coolness, and for a moment I thought about turning back. But I kept walking, convincing myself I'd just go a short distance in, maybe to the bend I could see ahead. The deeper I went, the more muffled the world became. Even my own footsteps seemed quieter. The trees were close together, their trunks dark and rough, their branches tangled high above, blocking out the sky. Every now and then, I would hear a small crack or rustle from somewhere in the underbrush, but I told myself it was just squirrels or birds moving around. Still, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once. After maybe 10 minutes, I reached the bend in the path. I could see the trail continuing deeper, sloping down again into a thicker part of the forest. Something about the way it disappeared into the dark made my stomach tighten, but I ignored it. I decided I'd keep going just a little farther. As I walked, the air began to feel heavier, almost damp. I could smell something faint but unpleasant, like rotting leaves or wet earth that had been sitting too long. The sound of my breathing seemed louder, and I realized I was starting to walk faster without meaning to. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination making me uneasy, that nothing was out here. But the silence was different now. It wasn't just quiet, it felt like something was listening. I noticed the first sound behind me when I stopped to adjust my shoelace. It was faint, almost nothing, but it was there, a small shift, like a foot pressing lightly into the dirt. I froze, holding still for several seconds, listening. There was nothing now except the blood rushing in my ears. I straightened up and kept walking, but slower this time, straining to hear. It came again, a faint crunch. Not close, but not far either. I didn't turn around right away. I just kept walking, telling myself it could be anything, a deer maybe. But after another few steps, I couldn't help it. I glanced over my shoulder. The path behind me was empty. I stared for several seconds, my eyes tracing the line of trees, the thick tangle of shadows between them. Nothing moved, but something about the space between those trees felt wrong, as if something was there, but I couldn't quite see it. I turned back and walked a little faster. My breathing had picked up, and I kept telling myself not to overreact. Then I heard it again, closer this time, a steady, deliberate crunch of leaves and twigs. Not hurried, not clumsy, just steady. I stopped dead, listening. The sound stopped too. I don't know how long I stood there. Maybe half a minute. My chest felt tight, and my fingers curled into fists without me thinking about it. I forced myself to keep going, but now my pace was quick, almost a jog. The path ahead curved again, and I thought if I could just get around the bend, I might see an opening or a way out to a field. When I reached the curve, I saw nothing but more trees. The ground was darker here, softer, and my shoes sank slightly into the damp dirt. The smell of decay was stronger. I looked to the left and saw the faint shape of an old fence half fallen, disappearing into the undergrowth. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I thought briefly about cutting through it and finding another way back, but the forest beyond was thick and unwelcoming. That's when I heard it again, only now it was off to my right, not directly behind me. A slow, careful step, followed by another. My chest tightened so much it hurt. I didn't turn to look. Something deep in my gut told me I didn't want to see what was there. I kept walking, forcing myself not to break into a run. I could feel the sweat starting to bead on my neck despite the cool air. Every nerve in my body was on edge, my ears straining to pick up every sound. The steps behind me would come and go. Sometimes I'd hear them for several seconds, then nothing, then they'd return again. Each time, they seemed to shift slightly to one side, as if whatever it was moving to get a better angle on me. I don't know how far I walked like that, but the light in the forest had grown dimmer, the air colder. I began to recognize nothing around me. I couldn't remember how many bends I had passed, or how far I'd come from the edge of the woods. A creeping panic started to set in, not just from the feeling of being followed, but from the realization that I might not even know the way back. Then, up ahead, I saw something that made my heart leap, a faint strip of pale light filtering through the trees. It looked like the edge of the forest. I quickened my pace, but the moment I did, the sound behind me picked up too, closer than ever. I could hear the weight in each step now, the soft compression of earth under something heavy. I didn't look back. I just walked faster, my eyes locked on that strip of light, every muscle in my legs burning with the effort not to break into a sprint. The steps behind me were closer still, matching me, always just far enough that I couldn't see. Finally, the trees began to thin. The pale light grew brighter, and I realized I was only a short distance from the open field at the edge of the road. The moment my feet hit the first patch of grass, the sound behind me stopped completely. I kept moving, crossing the field, not daring to slow down until I reached the dirt road again. I turned then, my chest heaving, and looked back at the line of trees. They stood still and silent, the shadows between them deep and unmoving. Nothing stirred. I walked the rest of the way home without hearing another sound, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, just inside the tree line, watching me go. Even now, I can still remember the way those footsteps matched mine, patient and steady, as if whatever was out there knew it didn't need to rush. And I never walked that road again. It started the same as most days do when you live alone in a quiet place far from town. The air was cold when I woke up, my breath faintly visible in the dim light coming through the thin curtains. I could smell the dampness left over from the rain the night before, the kind of smell that seeps into the wood of the cabin and lingers for hours. The silence outside was so complete that I could hear the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet as I moved around. No cars on the distant road, no dogs barking from the neighbor's property, just stillness. I made a cup of coffee and stepped out onto the porch, letting the steam rise up against my face. The sky was pale gray, the kind that makes you feel like the sun isn't in a hurry to come out. The tree line about 100 feet from the cabin stood dark and solid, and the ground between us was soaked enough to glisten faintly. I remember thinking it felt like a good day to check the trail markers I had set up deep in the woods a few months back. By mid-morning, I had my jacket zipped up, boots laced tight, and a small pack with a flashlight, water, and a folding knife, not because I was expecting trouble, but because carrying one had become habit. The air felt heavier under the trees, holding on to the last of the rain's scent. The ground sucked faintly at my boots with each step, and in some spots I could see the outlines of animal tracks pressed into the mud. The farther I went, the dimmer it got. Sunlight didn't travel well under the thick canopy, and in certain stretches it almost felt like dusk, even though it wasn't close to noon yet. I knew these woods. I knew the ridges, the creeks, the deadfall that forced you to climb or circle around. But the way the shadows fell could still make things look different. Trunks that seemed wider, clearings that seemed deeper, stumps that for just a second looked like someone crouched low. I'd learned not to trust my eyes here without taking a second look. An hour in, I reached one of the farthest points where I'd left a wooden stake to mark a potential side trail. The stake was still there, though the paint I'd put on it had mostly peeled away from the rain and frost. I knelt, pushed at the dirt around it, and felt the damp soil cling to my fingers. I was just about to stand when I heard something. It was faint, too faint at first to place. I froze and held my breath, every sound from my body suddenly too loud in my ears. It came again, slow, deliberate steps. Not the erratic quickness of a deer or the scattered scratching of a raccoon. These were heavy, spaced apart, and deliberate. Whoever it was, or whatever, it was moving with care. The sound was coming from deeper in, ahead of me but slightly off to the side. I stayed completely still. This wasn't public land. I hadn't seen another hiker out here in weeks, and hunting season was still months away. After maybe 20 seconds, the steps stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before, like the air itself was pressing in. I told myself it was probably nothing serious. Maybe someone's dog had wandered out here. Maybe a local cutting through to reach another property. Still, the way the sound had stopped exactly when I stopped moving made the back of my neck tighten. I adjusted my pack straps and started moving, but I chose a different direction, angling toward an old logging road that I knew would take me back toward my property. The terrain here was uneven, with wet leaves covering rocks and roots, so I had to step carefully. Every few seconds, I paused to listen. At first there was nothing, but soon enough, I could hear it again. The sound was quieter now, but still there, footsteps matching mine. When I sped up, they sped up. When I slowed, they slowed. They stayed just far enough away to remain out of sight, though I thought I caught the faintest shift between two trees at one point, like something straightening up from a crouch. My mouth went dry. I didn't run. Running in woods like these makes too much noise, and it's easy to lose your footing. Instead, I kept my pace brisk and steady, keeping my head forward, but using my peripheral vision to scan for movement. The ground was soft in places, so I moved in a way that avoided the loudest patches of leaves, even though my own heartbeat felt like it was making more noise than my steps. Eventually, the trees began to thin, and I could see the pale strip of the logging road through the branches. Normally that sight would bring relief, but the openness of the road made me feel exposed. It stretched far in both directions, patches of grass breaking through the gravel, and every shadow along the edges looked deeper than it should have been. I turned toward home, moving faster now. The gravel crunched under my boots in sharp bursts. I kept glancing to the left, toward the tree line that ran parallel to the road. I didn't see anything outright, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving there, just inside the shadows, keeping pace with me. Minutes passed like hours. The fence line to my property eventually came into view, just 2 weathered posts with rusted wire between them. My pace turned into a jog, my chest tight. The woods behind me stayed quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that didn't feel natural. I pushed the gate open and stepped through, not bothering to close it behind me. Instead of going inside, I stood on the porch, my eyes locked on the tree line. Everything was still. The shadows from the low sun stretched long across the wet grass, and for a moment I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it all. But I knew better. I'd been out in the woods enough times to know the difference between random noise and being followed. It's not just the sound, it's the rhythm, the way it reacts to you without showing itself. That night, I locked every door and window. I kept the lights off and stayed by the back window, where I could see the yard without being seen. Hours passed, nothing moved, but every now and then I thought I caught something far back between the trees, a darker patch against the dark, unmoving but there. I didn't sleep until the first pale light of morning, and even then, it was restless. Out here, there's enough space for someone to follow you without ever being caught, to watch you without ever stepping into the open. The worst part wasn't that it had followed me. It was that I had no idea how long it had been there before I noticed. For all I knew, it could have been watching from the very moment I stepped off the porch that morning, waiting for me to go far enough and where no one would hear me if I needed help. I woke up that morning with a strange sort of restlessness in my body. It wasn't the kind that comes from too much caffeine or a bad night's sleep. It was deeper, like my mind was itching for movement and quiet at the same time. I'd been stuck in the same loop for weeks. Work, eat, sit around, scroll through my phone, sleep, and repeat. It felt like I hadn't really breathed fresh air in ages. I didn't plan anything. I just grabbed a jacket, some water, my phone, and my keys, got in the car, and started driving without a real destination in mind. The roads outside the city got narrower and emptier the farther I went. I passed long stretches of farmland, old weathered barns, and fields where nothing was growing this time of year. Eventually, I spotted a thin dirt pull-off on the side of a quiet rural road. There was no sign, no parking area, nothing official, just enough space to park the car without blocking the road, and a faint track leading into a thick patch of woods. The entrance wasn't inviting. It was narrow and shadowed, with tangled undergrowth creeping toward the path. But something about it drew me in. I parked, turned off the engine, and stepped out. The moment I stepped into the shade of the trees, the air felt different. It was cooler, damp, and smelled strongly of wet leaves and soil. The ground underfoot was soft from recent rain, the kind that makes each step sink just enough to leave a faint print. Ferns brushed against my legs, and thin vines hung low from the branches, forcing me to duck now and then. I could hear my boots crunching through leaves and the occasional drip of water from branches above, but nothing else. No cars, no voices, no mechanical sounds in the distance. The quiet wasn't the soft kind you get in a park. This was heavier. The deeper I went, the more it pressed in on me. Bird calls came less often, and when they did, they sounded far away, like the birds themselves were keeping to the edges of the forest. Even the air felt still, as if the whole place was holding its breath. The trail itself was barely a trail at all. In some spots it was clear, a thin strip of packed dirt weaving between the trees. In others, it all but vanished under a blanket of wet leaves. I had to keep scanning ahead for signs of it, subtle dips in the ground, places where the weeds were a little more trampled, the faint marks left by shoes or maybe boots. I don't know how long I walked before I first noticed the ridge. It rose to my left, a steep wall of earth maybe 15 feet high, covered in roots and moss. The trail curved alongside it, and I followed it without thinking, my eyes drawn upward every so often. That's when I saw movement. It was just a flicker, something dark slipping between two trees up on top of the ridge. The motion was too smooth and too deliberate to be a falling branch or a trick of the wind. I stopped, craning my neck to get a better look, but nothing else moved. I told myself it was probably a deer, or maybe a stray dog wandering through. Still, there was something about the way it had moved, steady, unhurried, that didn't sit right. I kept going, though more aware now. The trail stayed alongside the ridge for a while before the ground on my left sloped down again, the higher ground vanishing from view. I tried to shake off the unease, but I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often. After a while, I decided to step off the path to collect some dry branches for the fire pit I had at home. I moved into a patch of thinner trees where the ground was littered with broken limbs. As I bent to pick one up, I noticed the soil here looked different, looser, darker, and faintly disturbed. Leaves had been pushed aside in a way that didn't look natural, like something heavy had moved through recently. I crouched down and brushed away some of the leaves. The ground beneath showed faint impressions, not clear enough to call them footprints, but long, shallow depressions, as if someone or something had been dragging their weight. They led deeper into the forest, away from the trail. That's when I heard it. Slow, heavy breathing. It came from somewhere ahead of me, not close, but not far enough away for comfort. Inhale. A long pause. Exhale. There was a weight to the sound, like the lungs making it were large. I froze, my own breath locked in my throat. My ears strained to pinpoint the direction, but the sound seemed to hang in the air, just far enough away to make it unclear. I stood still for what felt like a full minute. Then, faintly, I caught the suggestion of movement between the trees, a darker shadow moving in the dimness, slipping behind a trunk before I could focus on it. The breathing seemed to grow fainter, but not in a way that made me feel any safer. I told myself it could be a wild animal, a boar maybe, or a large stray dog, but the breathing didn't match. It wasn't the rapid, sharp panting of a stressed animal. It was measured, steady, almost deliberate. My pulse thudded in my ears as I slowly stepped backward, trying to find the trail again. When I spotted it, I didn't waste time. I stepped back onto the path and began walking quickly, my boots thudding softly against the damp earth. I kept my eyes forward, but my ears tuned behind me. That's when I heard it, a faint crack, like a stick snapping under weight. I didn't turn. My pace quickened. The path seemed longer on the way back, twisting and winding in a way I hadn't noticed before. The forest, which had felt open enough earlier, now seemed to crowd closer on either side. My breathing was loud now, my chest tightening, but I didn't slow. Every so often I thought I could hear faint movement behind me. Never loud enough to be certain, but enough to keep my heart pounding. When I finally began to see patches of brighter sky through the trees, I felt the first real wave of relief. The forest began to thin, the air lightening as I moved toward the edge. I still didn't look back. The moment my car came into view, I practically jogged the last stretch, pulling my keys from my pocket with shaking hands. I slid into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled out onto the road, I kept my eyes fixed forward. The forest disappeared in my rearview mirror within minutes, but the feeling didn't leave. Even miles away, my mind replayed the sound of that breathing, the slow rise and fall of air from something I never saw clearly. I knew it wasn't my imagination. I knew it was following me, matching my pace, staying just out of sight. When I got home, I locked the door immediately. I kept the curtains shut for the rest of the day, but the smell of damp earth still clung to my clothes, and every time I caught it, my shoulders tensed. I wanted to believe it was just an animal, that I had gotten spooked for no reason. But there had been intent in that sound, patience, awareness. I haven't gone back to that trail. I haven't even driven down that road again. Sometimes at night, when the air is still and the world outside my window is silent, I think about how it felt in that forest, how something stayed just far enough back to keep me from seeing it. And I wonder if it's still there, waiting for someone else to wander too far in. It started out like any other quiet day. I woke up before sunrise, the air still heavy with the damp smell of night. The world outside my small cabin was calm, still, and so silent that I could hear the distant rustle of leaves far off in the woods. The kind of silence that's almost alive, like it's holding its breath. I didn't think much of it. I made coffee, stepped out onto the porch, and just stood there for a while, letting the cool air settle into my skin. The trees at the edge of my property were motionless, just tall dark shapes against the faint morning light. There was something comforting about the stillness, something that made me think the day ahead would be slow and uneventful. By mid-morning, I decided to head deeper into the woods to check on some old trail markers I had set up months before. I often hiked these woods alone. They weren't huge, but they stretched far enough that you could wander for hours without hearing another human voice. The ground was soft under my boots, still wet from the rain the day before, and the earthy smell of soil and rotting leaves was strong. I followed the narrow path, stepping over exposed roots and ducking under low branches. The deeper I went, the dimmer it got. The canopy above was thick, blocking most of the sunlight, and in some spots it felt like late evening, even though it was barely noon. I knew these trails well, but even then, the shadows could make everything look different. A fallen log might seem like something crouching, or a tangle of branches could look like a figure standing still until you got close enough to see it clearly. I had learned not to let my eyes trick me out here. After about an hour of walking, I reached a part of the woods I didn't visit often. It was denser here, with no real trail, just patches of open ground between thick clusters of trees. I slowed my pace and listened. There was no wind, no birds, nothing. The silence was strange. Usually there were at least faint rustles from squirrels or the distant tapping of a woodpecker. Here, there was nothing at all. It was so quiet that I could hear the faint hum of blood in my ears. I crouched down to check one of the wooden stakes I had driven into the ground months ago to mark a potential route. The wood was weathered, the paint chipped away, but it was still there. I straightened up, brushing dirt from my hands, and that's when I caught it, a faint sound. It wasn't from behind me. It was ahead, deeper in. At first it was too soft to tell what it was. I held my breath and strained my ears. It came again, slightly clearer this time. Heavy, uneven steps. Not like a deer. Deer move light, quick, sometimes erratic. This was slow and deliberate, with long pauses between each step. The kind of pace you'd expect from a person picking their way carefully over uneven ground. I stayed completely still. There was no reason for anyone else to be this deep in these woods. It wasn't hunting season, and the land was private. I kept my eyes fixed in the direction of the sound, waiting for movement. Nothing. Just the slow steps, then silence. I told myself it was probably nothing serious. Maybe someone from farther down the road had wandered too far. Maybe it was a lost hiker. But something about the way the steps had stopped the moment I stopped moving didn't feel right. I started walking again, slowly, but I chose a different direction, heading toward a more open area I knew led to an old logging road. After about 10 minutes, I glanced over my shoulder. I didn't see anything at first, but then I noticed a subtle shift in the spaces between the trees. Something dark was there, not moving. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, and the shape seemed to straighten ever so slightly, like someone realizing they'd been spotted. I didn't wait. I quickened my pace, keeping my head forward. My heartbeat was steady at first, but then it began to climb, pounding harder with each step. I didn't run. Running can make you loud, obvious. Instead, I focused on getting out of the thicker part of the woods as quickly and quietly as I could. The ground was uneven, and every now and then I had to steady myself against a tree trunk. Each time I paused, I listened, and each time I could hear it, the faint crunch of leaves, a little way back, matching my movements. The trees began to thin, but that didn't calm me. I'd been out here enough to know that a lot could still happen in open ground. The worst part was that I had no clear visual on whatever was following me. It stayed just far enough away, hidden behind trunks and brush. I never saw a full figure, just the sense of presence, the sound of weight shifting through the undergrowth. When I finally reached the old logging road, I expected relief, but the openness made me feel more exposed. The road stretched in both directions, overgrown in spots, but still wide enough for a vehicle. I turned toward the way back home and moved fast. The gravel under my boots crunched loudly, too loudly, and I kept looking over my shoulder. The edge of the woods seemed darker now, like it was hiding something that didn't want to step out into the open. The sound of footsteps was gone, but that didn't ease the tightness in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been there was still watching me, maybe even moving parallel to the road, but keeping to the cover of the trees. My mouth was dry, and my hands felt cold despite the sweat gathering under my jacket. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted the faint glint of my property fence far ahead. My pace turned into a jog. I didn't hear anything behind me anymore, but the absence of sound felt just as threatening. I reached the gate, shoved it open, and didn't bother to latch it behind me. I didn't go straight inside. Instead, I went to the porch and stood there, looking back toward the tree line. Everything looked still again, calm, as if nothing had ever been there. The sun was low now, casting long shadows across the grass, and for a moment I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. But I knew better. You can tell when you've been followed, even if you never get a clear look at who or what it was. That night, I locked every window and door. I kept the lights off, standing near the back window where I could watch the yard without being seen. Hours passed, nothing moved, and the forest stayed quiet. But every so often, I thought I saw something far back between the trees, a shape that wasn't there the last time I looked, just still waiting. I didn't sleep until the sky began to turn pale with morning. Even then, I didn't feel safe. Out here, the woods aren't just scenery. They're deep enough, quiet enough, and empty enough for someone to follow you without ever being caught. And if they're patient, they can wait for you to come back. The worst part was knowing I had no idea how long it had been watching me before I noticed. For all I knew, it could have been there the moment I stepped off my porch that morning. It was late September when I decided to take a solo trip out to the old fishing cabin my uncle used to use when I was younger. The place sat deep in the woods, miles from the nearest paved road. I had been there a few times in the past, but always with someone else. This time, I wanted the quiet. I wanted to get away from the noise of everything: work, people, city life. I packed up my truck with enough supplies to last 3 or 4 days, figuring I'd fish in the mornings, hike in the afternoons, and spend the evenings by the small wood stove in the cabin. The drive was longer than I remembered, and the dirt road was rougher. My tires kicked up clouds of dust, and branches scraped against the sides of the truck. Every so often, I had to slow almost to a crawl to get over deep ruts or avoid large rocks that had rolled into the road. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin sat, the sun was already dipping low in the sky. The building was exactly how I remembered it: weathered wood siding, a tin roof dulled by years of rain, and a single window looking out toward the lake that stretched out beyond the tree line. I carried my gear inside and took stock of the place. It was simple: one room, a cot against the wall, a small table, a chair, and the wood stove. A pile of firewood was stacked neatly outside, though most of it looked old and dry enough to splinter. There was a faint smell of dust and old pine inside, the kind of scent that instantly takes you back in time. I opened the window to air it out while I unpacked. The first night passed quietly. I made a small fire in the stove, cooked some food on my camp burner, and listened to the crickets outside. The lake was calm, the moonlight shining across it like a pale silver path. It was so quiet that every small sound carried: a splash from a fish breaking the surface, the creak of tree branches, even the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. The second day, I woke early and decided to fish. The lake was still and glassy, the water so clear I could see the shadows of fish moving just beneath the surface. I spent hours out there, catching a few small ones, but nothing worth keeping. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was high, and the woods around me seemed alive with movement. Birds darting between trees, squirrels chasing each other along the branches, the occasional snap of a twig somewhere deeper in the forest. It wasn't until that afternoon, while hiking a trail I hadn't been on in years, that I first got the uneasy feeling. The path wound uphill through thick pines, and the further I went, the quieter it seemed to get. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet I'd felt at the lake. It was heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. My own footsteps sounded too loud, crunching against the dry needles on the ground. I kept going, telling myself it was just my imagination. A little while later, I heard it, a faint, deliberate sound behind me. Not an animal scurrying or the random snap of a branch from wind. This was slower, spaced apart. Footsteps. I stopped and turned, but the trail behind me was empty. I scanned the trees, looking for movement, but saw nothing. After a few moments, I shrugged it off and kept walking, though now my pace was quicker. The sound didn't return, but the uneasy feeling lingered until I made it back to the cabin. That night, the air felt different. It wasn't stormy, but it was heavier, almost humid. I left the window open for a breeze, but I kept glancing toward the darkness outside. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and without its light, the forest beyond the clearing was just a black wall. I tried to read a paperback I'd brought, but I couldn't focus on the words. At one point, I thought I heard something faint outside, a quick rustle, then silence. It might have been an animal, but the stillness that followed made me tense. I told myself it was nothing and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay there in the dark, listening to every creak and pop of the old cabin. Sometime in the night, I woke to a different sound. Soft, slow, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps in the clearing outside. I stayed completely still, straining my ears. The steps moved slowly around, not in a direct path, more like someone was circling. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. The steps stopped for a long moment. The silence was worse than the sound had been. I waited, barely breathing. Then, after what felt like forever, the steps started again, fading slowly into the woods. I didn't move for a long time after that, listening until I was sure they were gone. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back to sleep. In the morning, I checked outside. The dirt and grass around the cabin were undisturbed, except for my own tracks from the day before. I tried to tell myself I'd imagined it, that maybe it had been an animal after all, but I couldn't shake the certainty that those had been human steps. The day passed uneventfully. I stayed close to the cabin, chopped some of the older wood, and made sure I had plenty stacked inside. As the sun set, I decided to lock the door, something I hadn't bothered with the first 2 nights. That night, I heard them again. Footsteps. This time they came earlier, before I had even fallen asleep. They were closer, slower, and they didn't circle. They came straight toward the cabin. I sat up in bed, every nerve in my body screaming for me to do something, but I stayed still. The steps stopped just outside the window. I stared into the darkness, but it was too black to see anything. Then I heard it, the faint sound of breathing. Slow, steady, too steady for an animal. It was only a few feet away, on the other side of that thin wall. I stayed frozen, barely daring to move. After a long minute, the breathing stopped, and the steps moved away again, disappearing into the forest. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When dawn came, I packed my gear. I didn't even bother making breakfast. I wanted to be gone before the sun was fully up. The woods felt different as I drove out. Still beautiful, but with an edge I hadn't noticed before. When I reached the paved road hours later, I finally felt the tension ease from my body. But even now, weeks later, I keep thinking about those nights. I don't know who or what was out there, and I'm not sure I ever want to know. All I do know is that someone was close. Too close. And they weren't just passing through, they were watching. It was a late summer afternoon when I decided to take a long drive out of the city and into the back roads I hadn't been down in years. I didn't have any real plan, just wanted to get away from the noise and the constant rush of traffic. The sky was heavy with thick gray clouds, the kind that seemed to hang lower as the day went on. The air was humid but cool in the shade, with that faint smell of wet earth and plants, like it had rained somewhere nearby. The road narrowed as I drove, turning from smooth asphalt to uneven, cracked pavement, then to a rough gravel track that wound its way between overgrown fields and patches of woods. My phone signal had already dropped to 1 bar, then none, and I realized I hadn't seen another car in nearly an hour. It was quiet enough that when I turned off the radio, the only sound was the crunch of gravel under my tires and the occasional chirp of crickets in the tall grass. I wasn't looking for trouble. I wasn't even looking for adventure. But as I drove farther, I saw something off to the side, a narrow dirt path that cut into the trees. It wasn't marked, no sign, no gate, just a break in the brush where 2 deep tire ruts disappeared into the woods. It looked old and unused, like the kind of place where people might have driven in years ago, but had long since stopped. I slowed to a crawl, staring down that path. The trees on either side were thick and close, their branches arching overhead and blocking most of the light. The ground was littered with damp leaves and fallen branches. Something about it made me curious in a way I couldn't explain. I stopped the car right at the edge and thought about just turning around, but the idea of seeing where it went got stuck in my head. The ruts were just wide enough for my car, so I eased onto the path. Branches scraped along the sides, and leaves brushed against my windshield. The air seemed different here, more still, more heavy, almost muffled. After a few minutes, the path widened just enough to reveal a small clearing. There were no buildings, no signs of recent activity, but the grass was pressed down in strange patches, like something had been lying there. I parked in the middle and got out, the ground soft under my shoes. The smell here was stronger, wet soil mixed with something faintly sour. I walked to the edge of the clearing where the trees grew tighter again, peering into the dimness between the trunks. The light was weak under the canopy, and the deeper I looked, the more details seemed to vanish into the shadows. I decided to walk just a little ways in. The ground was uneven, roots twisting up through the dirt, and I had to step carefully. My breathing sounded louder here, and I noticed how quickly the clearing disappeared behind me, swallowed by the dark shapes of trees. I kept going, scanning the ground and listening, though I wasn't sure for what. After maybe 5 minutes, I heard it, something moving. It was faint at first, just a soft shifting sound, but steady like weight pressing through undergrowth. I stopped and listened. It wasn't the wind, because the trees were barely swaying. I told myself it could have been an animal, maybe a deer. But the sound wasn't fading or running off. It was matching my pace, stopping when I stopped. I turned around, but all I saw were trees and shadows. My pulse started to pick up, and I realized I had gone far enough. I headed back the way I'd come, quickening my pace without breaking into a run. The sound started again, faint but clear, moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped. I could feel the hairs on my neck standing up. The moment the clearing came into view, I walked faster, almost breaking into a jog. I got into the open space and turned toward the woods, staring hard into the dimness. There was nothing I could clearly see, but I felt watched, as if something was just far enough back to stay hidden. I didn't waste more time. I got into my car, started it up, and turned around, backing slowly until I could face the path out. As I pulled onto the dirt track, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see movement at the edge of the clearing. The drive back along that narrow path felt longer than before. Every branch that brushed the car made me flinch. When I finally rolled onto the gravel road again, I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders, but not all. I kept my speed steady, not wanting to slide on the loose gravel. I'd been driving maybe 10 minutes when I noticed something odd in the mirror. The dust from my car was hanging in the air longer than it should have, disturbed in a way that didn't match just my movement. My first thought was that another vehicle was behind me, but when I slowed to check, there was nothing. Still, the unsettled feeling came rushing back, and I pressed harder on the gas. It took nearly an hour to get back to a proper road with fresh pavement. By then, I was telling myself I'd just been on edge for no reason, that the sound in the woods had been an animal and nothing more. But when I stopped at a small gas station on the outskirts of a town, I noticed something on the back of my car. It was faint, barely visible against the dust, but there were streaks down the trunk like something had dragged its fingers along the metal. Not claws, fingers. 5 thin lines on one side, for on the other, angled slightly, as if from someone holding on while I drove. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at those marks, the cool evening air pressing against my skin. I didn't take a picture. I didn't wipe them off. I just got back in the car and drove straight home, the whole time checking my mirrors, even though I knew I wouldn't see anything. That night, I parked under the brightest streetlight near my building. I locked the car twice and checked the back seat before I went inside. When I finally lay down, I thought about that narrow path and the sound in the woods. I knew I wouldn't be going back, not to that road, not to that clearing. Whatever had been out there, it hadn't wanted to be seen, and I was sure it had followed me farther than I wanted to believe. It started with a plan I didn't think much about. I had a free weekend, and I wanted to get away from everything for a while. I drove out toward the hills, taking the long road that wound through farmland and scattered patches of forest until it reached an old trail I had read about online. The trail was hardly used anymore, but it was supposed to cut through a stretch of remote woodland and eventually open onto a clearing where you could camp. It wasn't an official campsite, so there'd be no one else around. Exactly what I wanted. I parked my car on a patch of dirt just off the road, where the trail began. The late afternoon light was golden, and the air was still. The place was quiet in a way that made you feel like you were far from anything human. I strapped on my pack, locked the car, and started walking. The trail was narrow, with tall grass brushing at my legs and branches hanging low enough that I had to duck under them. The woods thickened quickly, shutting out more and more of the light as I went. The first hour was calm. I walked at an easy pace, listening to my boots crunch over the dirt and small twigs. The trees were dense, but the trail was just visible enough to follow. I stopped once to take a sip of water and check my phone, but there was no signal. That didn't surprise me. I kept going, and after another 20 minutes, I reached the clearing I'd been heading for. It wasn't big, just a flat space surrounded by pines, with a patch of bare ground that looked perfect for a tent. I set up camp slowly, taking my time to find a spot where the ground wasn't too uneven. I unpacked my sleeping bag, laid out my gear, and gathered some dead branches for a small fire. As the sun dipped lower, I lit the fire and watched the flames flicker, feeling the quiet sink in around me. Out here, there was no hum of traffic, no distant voices, just the sound of the fire popping and the occasional rustle of wind in the trees. As the light faded, the temperature dropped fast. I pulled on an extra layer, sat by the fire, and ate a simple dinner from the food I'd brought. When it got dark fast, like someone had turned off a light switch. The firelight made the surrounding trees look even blacker. I didn't linger outside too long. I banked the fire so it wouldn't burn too hot and slipped into my tent. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the forest. At first, it was peaceful, the occasional chirp of a night insect, the faint groan of tree branches swaying. But as I drifted towards sleep, I noticed something. The sound seemed to stop. It was sudden, like the woods had frozen. I held my breath without meaning to, my ears straining for any sign of movement. There was a sound then, a faint rhythmic crunch. Leaves and twigs breaking, spaced out evenly, like footsteps. At first I thought it might be an animal. Out here, deer or maybe a fox wouldn't be unusual. But the steps sounded heavy, too deliberate. They were slow, like someone was taking careful steps just outside the glow of the fire. I stayed still. My tent wasn't far from the fire, but I couldn't see outside without unzipping it. The footsteps continued for a while, moving in a slow circle around the camp. Then they stopped. Minutes passed. I told myself it was probably an animal sniffing around, and that I was overthinking it. Eventually, I must have dozed off. When I woke, it was still dark, but the fire had burned low. My watch said it was just past 3 a.m. At first I didn't know why I'd woken up, but then I heard it again, movement. Not close this time, but not far either. A steady, dragging sound, like something being pulled along the ground. I sat up in my bag, my heart beating faster. I unzipped the tent just a few inches and peeked out. The clearing was barely lit by the dying fire. At the far edge of the light, something moved between the trees. I couldn't make out a shape, just the faint outline of something tall that shifted in and out of sight. It didn't rush away like an animal would. Instead, it seemed to stand there for a moment, and then the dragging sound came again before it slipped deeper into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. I sat there, every sense on high alert, until the first pale light of dawn. When the sun finally rose, I stepped out of the tent, scanning the trees. I didn't see anything unusual at first, but when I walked to the edge of the clearing, I noticed something on the ground. A narrow path of disturbed leaves and broken twigs led off into the woods, almost like something, or someone, had dragged something heavy through there during the night. I debated following it, but my gut told me not to. Instead, I packed up my gear quickly, more focused than I'd been in a long time. I kept glancing toward the trees as I worked, feeling watched. The hike back felt longer than it had the day before. Every little sound in the woods made me tense. I kept looking over my shoulder, but the trail stayed empty. It wasn't until I saw my car through the trees that I felt the knot in my chest loosen. I loaded my gear, started the engine, and got back on the road without looking back. It wasn't until I was several miles away, back on the main highway, that I realized something. On the hike in, I'd passed a fallen tree about halfway along the trail. It had been covered in moss and looked like it had been there for years. But on the way out, that same tree had fresh cuts along the trunk, as if someone had been hacking at it with a blade. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I know I wasn't alone, and I know I won't be going back. It started on a late summer afternoon, the kind where the air feels heavy and still, as if it's holding something back. I had decided to take a long walk in an area I didn't visit much, a stretch of open land that eventually led into a dense patch of woods. The place was far from town, with no houses in sight and only a narrow dirt road leading in. I had been there a few times before, but only during the day and never for more than an hour or two. It wasn't a place people visited often. There were no official trails, just faint paths left by deer or the occasional hiker who had wandered off the beaten track. The sun was beginning to sink lower, and I could feel the light starting to shift, that slow dimming that makes shadows stretch longer and colors turn muted. The dirt road crunched under my shoes until I left it behind and stepped into the grass, moving toward the tree line. The grass here grew tall and uneven, brushing against my legs, carrying the smell of dry earth and faint traces of wild plants. A warm breeze would occasionally move through, but mostly it was still, so still that each step I took felt louder than it should have been. I reached the edge of the woods and stepped inside. The change in temperature hit me immediately, cooler, with a faint dampness to the air. The ground was softer here, covered in old leaves, pine needles, and small twigs that cracked softly under my weight. The smell of the forest was strong, a mix of soil, old wood, and the faint scent of moss. The trees were close together, their branches weaving overhead to create a canopy that let in only thin streaks of light. I followed a faint path, nothing official, just a space where the undergrowth had been pressed down enough to walk through without pushing branches aside. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The sounds of the open land behind me faded until all I could hear was my own movement, the occasional rustle of leaves high above, and once or twice the faint snap of a branch somewhere deeper in the woods. Each sound seemed sharper here, the silence around it making it stand out more. After maybe 20 minutes of walking, I reached a small clearing. The ground was uneven here, with patches of grass between bare spots of dirt. A fallen tree lay to one side, its bark stripped away in places, showing pale wood underneath. I paused there, breathing in the cool air and looking around. It was quiet, but not in the calm, peaceful way you might expect. It was a heavy quiet, the kind that made you feel watched even when you knew no one was there. I couldn't explain why, but I felt uneasy standing there, as if I had walked somewhere I shouldn't have. I turned back toward the path I had come from, ready to head out before it got too dark, but that was when I noticed something odd. The sound I made while walking, my own footsteps on the soft forest floor, seemed to have a slight delay. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I realized it wasn't. I would take a step, and almost a second later, I would hear another faint step from somewhere behind me. I stopped completely, and the forest was silent again. My eyes scanned the trees, searching for movement, but everything was still. I took another slow step forward, deliberately dragging my shoe a little, so I could hear it clearly. The sound came again, soft, muted, but definitely there, almost the same as mine, but not quite in sync. My heartbeat picked up. It could have been an animal, maybe a deer following the path, but the sound felt too precise, too much like someone stepping carefully. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that maybe the sound was echoing off the trees in a strange way, but the unease in my stomach grew. I decided to walk faster, not quite running, but keeping a steady, quick pace back toward the edge of the woods. The faint following sound stayed with me. Each time I stepped, it came again a moment later, as though something was matching my path, but keeping a distance. I resisted the urge to look over my shoulder too often, worried that if I saw something, I wouldn't be able to keep my composure. My breaths grew sharper, and the cool air felt colder now, making the skin on my arms prickle. The path ahead began to look unfamiliar. I was sure I had followed the same way in, but now the trees seemed closer together, and the ground looked different, with more roots and uneven dips in the dirt. I slowed down just enough to check my surroundings, and that was when I heard it again, not just one step this time, but two close together, faster than before. They were closer. I turned my head quickly and caught a flicker of movement, a darker shape between the trees, just at the edge of where the light reached. I couldn't make out a person or an animal, only that something had been there and had moved out of sight the instant I turned. My chest tightened. The forest felt smaller now, pressing in from all sides. I pushed forward, not bothering to stay quiet anymore, letting my footsteps land heavy as I moved. My eyes scanned constantly, trying to pick up any movement ahead or to the sides. Every few seconds, I would hear it again, that faint but distinct sound of something stepping where I had just been, never too close, but never far enough to feel safe. Minutes passed like that, my sense of direction breaking down as I focused more on moving forward than on where exactly I was going. The light in the forest had dimmed further, and the air felt colder still. I could feel sweat at the back of my neck, mixing with the cool air to make me shiver. Then I saw it, the faint light between the trees ahead. It wasn't the open field I had entered from. but it looked like a break in the woods, somewhere I could get out of the dense cover. I moved faster, almost jogging now, my bag shifting slightly on my back with each step. The sounds behind me kept pace, never rushing, just following. When I reached the opening, I found myself at the edge of a steep drop. Below was a shallow ravine, its bottom filled with rocks and a narrow stream of water. The other side rose sharply, covered in more trees. There was no easy way down without risking a fall. My only option was to turn and find another path, but the thought of going back into the woods in that direction made my stomach turn. The following steps were gone now. The silence was thick, so complete it made my ears ring. I stood there for a few seconds, frozen, waiting for a sound, any sound. That was when I caught it again, just one step this time, off to my left, closer than before. My eyes locked on that direction, but nothing moved. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the spot. My foot slipped slightly on loose dirt near the edge, sending a few small stones tumbling down into the ravine. The sound echoed faintly, then faded. I could feel my pulse in my neck. I turned sharply and started moving along the edge, looking for any sign of the original path out. After what felt like forever, I found a slope that led up and away from the ravine, the ground rising toward what I hoped was the edge of the forest. My legs burned as I climbed, and my breath came fast, but I didn't stop. The trees began to thin, and soon I could see the faint glow of open land beyond them. I pushed through the last of the branches and stepped into the tall grass again. I stopped there, looking back at the dark wall of trees. Nothing moved. No sound followed me out. The field was quiet except for the faint rustle of grass in the wind. My breathing slowed gradually, but my skin still felt tight, my senses sharpened as if expecting something to appear. I walked quickly across the open land, not looking back again until I reached the dirt road. From there, I could see the woods in the distance, the shadows between the trees already blending into one dark mass as the last of the light faded. I stood for a moment, staring at that edge, wondering if I had been followed by someone or if my mind had twisted natural sounds into something else entirely. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. The sound of those steps had been too deliberate, too perfectly timed to my own. Someone, or something, had been there, moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped, always staying just far enough away to keep hidden. I left without stopping again, and even as I reached the safety of my home later, the image of that dark shape between the trees stayed with me. I never went back to that part of the woods, and even now, years later, if I walk alone in a quiet place and hear a sound just a little too similar to my own footsteps, my chest tightens, and I remember exactly how it felt to be followed in those silent woods, with no idea what was behind me and no one around to help. It started as just another drive, nothing special, nothing worth remembering. I had been on the road since early morning, heading toward a small town several hours away to deliver some documents for work. I decided to take a back road instead of sticking to the main highway, mostly because I wanted a change of scenery and I thought it would be quicker. The road wound through thick stretches of forest, the kind where trees grew so close together their branches overlapped above the road like a tunnel. The asphalt was old, with cracks spreading in every direction and faded lines that were barely visible. Every few minutes, I'd pass a bend where the forest closed in even tighter, and the sunlight faded until it was little more than a dim glow between the leaves. It was late afternoon when I first started to get the uneasy feeling, the kind that creeps up slowly, without any real reason, and just sits in the back of your mind. I kept driving, telling myself it was nothing, but I realized I hadn't passed another car for almost 40 minutes. No houses, no gas stations, not even a driveway. Just endless trees and the faint sound of my tires on the road. My phone sat in the cup holder, and I noticed the signal bar had dropped to nothing a while back. That made me uneasy too, but I tried to brush it off. The road dipped and curved sharply to the right, and as I came around the bend, I saw something up ahead. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer, standing near the edge of the road. But as I got closer, I realized it was a man. He stood just inside the tree line, half hidden in the shadows, facing the road. His clothes looked dirty, like he'd been outside for days. He didn't move as I passed, just stood there watching. I didn't slow down. I didn't want to. My eyes flicked to the mirror as soon as I cleared the bend, but by the time I looked back, he was gone. For a few miles, I kept scanning the sides of the road, half expecting to see him again. The feeling in my gut was heavier now, an instinctive warning that something wasn't right. I wanted to drive faster, but the road was narrow, and I didn't know how sharp the turns would be ahead. The air inside the car felt warmer, heavier, like the windows were locked shut even though they were open an inch. A few minutes later, I saw a small pull-off on the right side of the road, a patch of gravel just wide enough for one car. I slowed, thinking I could stop for a moment to stretch my legs and drink some water. As soon as I put my foot on the brake, I caught sight of something in the mirror. Far behind me, maybe 100 yards back, someone was walking along the edge of the road. I didn't know if it was the same man from before, but my chest tightened at the sight. He wasn't walking toward me. He was walking in the same direction I was going, slow and steady, like he had all the time in the world. I pressed the gas again and kept moving. My water bottle stayed untouched on the seat. I didn't look back for several miles, but when I finally did, there was no one there. Still, I couldn't shake the thought of him, and every shadow between the trees seemed deeper, darker, like something could be hiding in them. The sun had dropped lower now, and the road was even dimmer. In the fading light, everything looked different, less familiar, even though I'd just passed it. I checked the clock on the dash. I should have been out of the forest by now, or at least close, but it felt like I was going in circles. The same cracked asphalt, the same leaning pine trees, the same long stretches without a single sign of life. My stomach knotted tighter. Then my low fuel light came on. The orange glow on the dash felt like a warning I couldn't ignore. I hadn't seen a gas station since before I turned onto this road, and now I started to realize how deep into nowhere I really was. I slowed at each curve, hoping I'd see a driveway, a building, anything, but there was nothing. Just trees, shadows, and the sound of my engine. I came around another bend and saw something that made my skin crawl. Off to the side, in a small clearing, there was an old truck. Its paint was faded, and it sat at an angle like one of its tires was flat. The hood was open, and the driver's door hung wide. It didn't look abandoned, not completely. The air felt different as I passed it, like the forest was holding its breath. I kept my eyes forward, but in my peripheral vision, I thought I saw a movement in the shadows beyond the truck. My foot pressed harder on the gas without me thinking about it. The next 10 minutes felt longer than the whole drive so far. Every bend looked the same. Every hill dropped into another stretch of empty road. My fuel gauge kept sinking, and I started to realize I couldn't keep going forever. I needed to stop somewhere, but stopping out here felt like the worst possible thing I could do. Finally, I saw a break in the trees ahead. It wasn't a town, just a small dirt road branching off to the right. I slowed down, thinking maybe it led to a farmhouse or a cabin. The turn was sharp, and as soon as I started down it, I knew it was a mistake. The road was little more than 2 ruts in the dirt, the trees pressing and even closer than before. Branches scraped the sides of the car, and the ground was uneven. I drove for maybe half a minute before realizing it didn't open up at all. There was no sign of any building, just more woods. I stopped and put the car in reverse, my eyes flicking to the mirrors. That's when I saw him. He was standing at the mouth of the dirt road, back on the pavement, blocking the way out. I couldn't see his face in the dim light, but I could see the shape of him, tall, shoulders slightly hunched, not moving. My hands clenched the steering wheel. I didn't know how long he'd been standing there, but the thought that he might have followed me sent a cold wave through my chest. I didn't move. Neither did he. The forest around us was silent, no birds, no insects, just the faint tick of my cooling engine. My heart thudded so loud I could feel it in my neck. I tried to tell myself I could just wait, that maybe he'd leave, but every second felt heavier, pressing me to act. Without thinking it through, I threw the car into drive and jerked the wheel to the left, aiming straight toward the trees off the dirt road. Branches snapped against the hood as I forced my way through, the car bouncing over roots and rocks. I kept going until I couldn't see the road anymore. My hands shook on the wheel, my breath coming fast. When I finally stopped, I turned off the headlights. The forest swallowed me whole. I sat there in the dark, listening, waiting. For a long time, there was nothing, just the sound of my breathing and the occasional creak of the cooling engine. Then, faintly, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving somewhere behind me. I stayed still, every muscle locked, gripping the steering wheel as if that would keep me safe. The footsteps stopped. Minutes passed. I didn't move. I didn't start the car. I just waited, the darkness pressing in, knowing that somewhere out there, he was still standing in the trees, waiting too. By the time I finally worked up the nerve to drive out, Hours had passed, and the forest was completely black. I never saw him again, but every mile I put between myself and those woods felt like I was escaping something I wasn't supposed to survive. Even now, I don't know if it was all in my head or if he was really following me. But I do know this: when a place makes every instinct you have screamed to leave, you should listen. Because out there, in the empty stretches where no one can hear you, there are things worse than getting lost. It started with a plan I didn't think much about. I had a free weekend, and I wanted to get away from everything for a while. I drove out toward the hills, taking the long road that wound through farmland and scattered patches of forest until it reached an old trail I had read about online. The trail was hardly used anymore, but it was supposed to cut through a stretch of remote woodland and eventually open onto a clearing where you could camp. It wasn't an official campsite, so there'd be no one else around. Exactly what I wanted. I parked my car on a patch of dirt just off the road, where the trail began. The late afternoon light was golden, and the air was still. The place was quiet in a way that made you feel like you were far from anything human. I strapped on my pack, locked the car, and started walking. The trail was narrow, with tall grass brushing at my legs and branches hanging low enough that I had to duck under them. The woods thickened quickly, shutting out more and more of the light as I went. The first hour was calm. I walked at an easy pace, listening to my boots crunch over the dirt and small twigs. The trees were dense, but the trail was just visible enough to follow. I stopped once to take a sip of water and check my phone, but there was no signal. That didn't surprise me. I kept going, and after another 20 minutes, I reached the clearing I'd been heading for. It wasn't big, just a flat space surrounded by pines, with a patch of bare ground that looked perfect for a tent. I set up camp slowly, taking my time to find a spot where the ground wasn't too uneven. I unpacked my sleeping bag, laid out my gear, and gathered some dead branches for a small fire. As the sun dipped lower, I lit the fire and watched the flames flicker, feeling the quiet sink in around me. Out here, there was no hum of traffic, no distant voices, just the sound of the fire popping and the occasional rustle of wind in the trees. As the light faded, the temperature dropped fast. I pulled on an extra layer, sat by the fire, and ate a simple dinner from the food I'd brought. When it got dark fast, like someone had turned off a light switch. The firelight made the surrounding trees look even blacker. I didn't linger outside too long. I banked the fire so it wouldn't burn too hot and slipped into my tent. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the forest. At first, it was peaceful, the occasional chirp of a night insect, the faint groan of tree branches swaying. But as I drifted toward sleep, I noticed something. The sound seemed to stop. It was sudden, like the woods had frozen. I held my breath without meaning to, my ears straining for any sign of movement. There was a sound then, a faint rhythmic crunch. Leaves and twigs breaking, spaced out evenly, like footsteps. At first I thought it might be an animal. Out here, deer or maybe a fox wouldn't be unusual. But the steps sounded heavy, too deliberate. They were slow, like someone was taking careful steps just outside the glow of the fire. I stayed still. My tent wasn't far from the fire, but I couldn't see outside without unzipping it. The footsteps continued for a while, moving in a slow circle around the camp. Then they stopped. Minutes passed. I told myself it was probably an animal sniffing around, and that I was overthinking it. Eventually, I must have dozed off. When I woke, it was still dark, but the fire had burned low. My watch said it was just past 3 a.m. At first I didn't know why I'd woken up, but then I heard it again, movement. Not close this time, but not far either. A steady, dragging sound, like something being pulled along the ground. I sat up in my bag, my heart beating faster. I unzipped the tent just a few inches and peeked out. The clearing was barely lit by the dying fire. At the far edge of the light, something moved between the trees. I couldn't make out a shape, just the faint outline of something tall that shifted in and out of sight. It didn't rush away like an animal would. Instead, it seemed to stand there for a moment, and then the dragging sound came again before it slipped deeper into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. I sat there, every sense on high alert, until the first pale light of dawn. When the sun finally rose, I stepped out of the tent, scanning the trees. I didn't see anything unusual at first, but when I walked to the edge of the clearing, I noticed something on the ground. A narrow path of disturbed leaves and broken twigs led off into the woods, almost like something, or someone, had dragged something heavy through there during the night. I debated following it, but my gut told me not to. Instead, I packed up my gear quickly, more focused than I'd been in a long time. I kept glancing toward the trees as I worked, feeling watched. The hike back felt longer than it had the day before. Every little sound in the woods made me tense. I kept looking over my shoulder, but the trail stayed empty. It wasn't until I saw my car through the trees that I felt the knot in my chest loosen. I loaded my gear, started the engine, and got back on the road without looking back. It wasn't until I was several miles away, back on the main highway, that I realized something. On the hike in, I'd passed a fallen tree about halfway along the trail. It had been covered in moss and looked like it had been there for years. But on the way out, that same tree had fresh cuts along the trunk, as if someone had been hacking at it with a blade. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I know I wasn't alone, and I know I won't be going back.